The universe held its breath the night Ori was born, and in that pause between one heartbeat and the next, something shifted in the fabric of reality itself. It wasn't a dramatic tear or violent rupture. Nothing like that. Instead, it was as if the cosmos had been carrying tension in its shoulders for eons and finally allowed itself to exhale, releasing a sigh that tasted of cinnamon and distant rain, settling like a gentle benediction over the small town that existed in one of those pockets of reality where time moves according to kindness rather than precision. Rain drifted in a fine hush that evening, as if it had been taught to fall softly, and the streetlights of Millhaven dimmed themselves to a warm, sleepy gold. The town itself was a tapestry, woven from whispered histories and forgotten dreams, where houses leaned into each other like old friends, and the clocks in shop windows never quite agreed on the time, not because they were broken, but because here moments were measured in the space between heartbeats rather than the mechanical ticking of seconds. Somewhere in the spaces between buildings, a melody was playing that no one could place, half lullaby, half memory, threading through alleyways and along the eaves like a patient hand smoothing a wrinkled sheet. Mrs. Chen, closing up her flower shop 3 blocks from the town square, paused with her hand on the door handle as the air began to shimmer just slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, though it was October and the evening carried the crisp promise of frost. She found herself humming along to the distant tune without realizing it, her keys forgotten in her palm, as the music wrapped around her like a soft shawl. The melody was familiar in the way that childhood lullabies are familiar, even when you can't remember who first sang them to you. It rose and fell with a gentle cadence that made her think of rocking chairs and warm milk, of hands smoothing blankets and voices whispering that everything would be all right. As she listened, the wind carried something else, a single syllable that never learned to become a name. Ruit, and then nothing, like a candle wick pinched gently between fingertips, the smoke climbing and curling into the rafters of the sky before dissolving into the night air like sugar in warm tea. Samuel was closing his cafe when that same pause settled over everything, the hush holding the evening like cupped hands around a small flame. He was the kind of man who polished cups as if every cup were an apology accepted, who stacked plates with the care of laying down soft truths. The espresso machine had gone from its daytime bravado to a slow, drowsy rhythm, its metal sides exhaling warmth into the night like a contented cat. He heard the bell above the door make the idea of a sound, just the suggestion of a ring, as if it were remembering its purpose from a dream, and turned to find no one standing there, only damp air and the scent of cinnamon drifting back inside. As the rain leaned in to smell the coffee, he didn't see the child at first. The booth by the window had gathered a fog of people's breath throughout the day and now wore it like a shawl. The streetlight outside touched the tabletop with a pale coin of light, and there, tucked into the space where morning would later sit and look out at the ordinary world, lay a small body, swaddled in the sort of blanket that feels like it's been washed too many times by hands that preferred gentleness to instructions. No crying, no confusion, only a tiny rise and fall that aligned itself without effort with the rhythm of the espresso machine, a pocket of sleep that had chosen a table by the window. The child's face was the kind that makes you believe in forgiveness, soft, even in shadow, with the suggestion of a smile always ready to be practiced. When Samuel lifted the blanket's edge, the small hand, still damp with weather, latched around his finger. It was not a request. It was acceptance. It felt like someone handing him the end of a thread and trusting him to keep it from tangling. Samuel paused in the doorway between doing and letting be. The syllable that had failed to become a name brushed past his ear like a moth and dissolved into his hair. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. Later he would wonder at the order of it, how the baby had arrived without footprints on the mat, without the bell giving itself fully to the small miracle of an opening door. For now he warmed a towel in the dryer, the hum of it a low domestic hymn, and wrapped the little one as if installing them into a promise. He whispered the kind of things you say to new life. You are safe here. You are allowed to be. It's okay to keep sleeping. The espresso machine, catching the tone, sighed again in harmonious agreement. What do you call something that arrives answer first? Question later. Samuel tried a few sounds in the quiet to see how they fit. Each one echoed too much in the gentle space. His eyes went to the espresso machine, where a fresh pull had left a glazed circle of crema that, for just a breath, took the shape of a small, bright sun. It felt like a hint he had not earned but was allowed to keep. "Ori," he said toward the blanket, testing the name in a voice that had spent most of its life keeping other people from breaking. The child's eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly, the way a dream adjusts its mood. "Ori," he repeated, and the room gave a gentle nod, as if the cafe itself had been waiting to learn this particular word. Upstairs, the plants on the fire escape leaned in, their leaves collecting rain and passing it down to the next leaf and the next. Tiny kindness upon tiny kindness, until the last droplet found the soil, and the soil said yes. Her stray cat paused at the window's ironwork, gazed in on the pair, man and child and steam, blinked gravely, and chose to curl on the doormat out of the rain, as if to say, "I will keep watch from here." There are origins that insist on spectacle, and then there are beginnings that prefer to take off their shoes at the door. This was the latter. Ori's arrival not announced by fanfare, but settled into existence with the quiet confidence of dawn breaking over familiar hills. The ledger by the register, where Samuel kept notes about regular orders and the croissant. Batch that never behaved, received a new line in neat handwriting, found between breaths, sleeping well. The night went on in the agreeable way of nights that have decided to end early. Samuel made himself a half cup of coffee, more for the ceremony than the caffeine, and sat across from Ori, not quite believing and not needing to. He watched the rain slacken to a conversation with the windows, and if a stranger had come in right then and asked a complicated question about the universe, Samuel would have told them the answer was simple. Sometimes the world chooses a smaller shape because it finally can. Throughout the town, others felt the shift without naming it. At the small medical center, Dr. Martinez paused in his late-night rounds, suddenly aware that the harsh fluorescent lighting had somehow become gentle and golden, that even the sounds of the hospital, the beeping monitors, the distant conversations, the hum of machinery, had arranged themselves into something that felt almost musical. The usual tension that lived in his shoulders from long hours and difficult cases seemed to be melting away, replaced by a sense of profound peace he couldn't quite explain. There was a lullaby Samuel hadn't sung in years, not to anyone, not even to himself, and it rose in him without needing permission, the melody finding his throat like a path it already knew. It was not a song about keeping away monsters or promising impossible safeties. It was about shorelines and bread rising, and clouds that looked like animals, and the particular kindness of morning light finding a worn tabletop. Ori's breathing matched the refrain, and in the kind of coincidence that happens too often to be coincidence, the espresso machine let out a little hiss precisely when the song asked for a quiet star. Dawn does not always break. Sometimes it arrives, barefoot, carrying its shoes. The rain finished its sentence and began to forget what it had said. The sky rinsed itself of worry, and when it became clear that morning had decided to commit, Samuel set the chairs down from their overnight tips and flipped the sign to open. He placed Ori's booth in the just right angle of the window so that gentle light could become a visitor, and he went about making the cafe look like it had always been this way, which, in a manner of speaking, it had. The first regular to come in was Mrs. Chen, still carrying the echo of that mysterious melody from the night before. She saw the bundle at the window and, like someone recognizing a tune before the first chord, softened completely. "Ah," she said at last. She offered no questions, only a knitted hat she had once made for a grandchild who had outgrown it too quickly. She had been carrying it in her pocket for months, waiting for a moment like this to present itself. The hat fit as if measured by the rain itself. Others drifted in slowly, as people do when they feel they are entering a room that understands them. An old man who never asked for anything stronger than chamomile stood by the booth for a full minute, with his hand hovering above the blanket, a benediction held at a respectful distance, before he ordered toast and said he'd take it with extra. Patience? Two teenagers left a paper crane by the sugar packets without acknowledging it, No one used words like miracle. A baby sleeping in a cafe is not a miracle in any usual sense. It is something better, an ordinary thing expanded, a gentle presence that reminded everyone to breathe a little deeper, to move a little more softly through their day. The day gathered around them like a warm shawl. Ori slept through the complicated sounds of human hunger, small spoons chiming against porcelain, conversations warming their hands around shared topics, the espresso machine returning to its daytime stride. Every so often a dimple appeared, then faded, like sunlight finding the floor through moving leaves. When they did wake, late morning, it was not with a start but like a boat touching shore, their eyes opening the color of twilight skies, holding depths that seemed to listen to something magnificent and just out of reach. Samuel did what he knew. He offered sustenance. A bottle found its way to the right temperature. The warm towel again did its humble work. He didn't know if he was doing everything as a book might say, but his hands did not hesitate, and Ori's mouth found what was offered with the same peaceful acceptance they had shown in sleep. The rhythm that had once been the espresso machines alone now became a duet, a gentle conversation between the mechanical and the miraculous. By noon, the cafe had transformed itself around this new presence. A basket had appeared with soft blankets and a stuffed animal that looked like it had been mended more than it had been stitched in the first place. Mira from the building across the way, the one with plants on her roof that minded no one's opinion but the sun's, came in with small pots that smelled like waking up without an alarm. "For the air," she said, placing a sprig of something bright in a jar near the booth. "It teaches rooms how to breathe." She met Ori's gaze with the respect one gives to new citizens. "Hello, little light," she murmured, and the room decided, collectively, that both the name and the greeting had settled into their proper places. As the afternoon grazed toward evening, the light turned that forgiving shade that makes even mistakes look deliberate. Samuel wiped down the counter and felt the day's questions stretch and yawn before finding places to curl up for the night. He looked at Ori, who had fallen asleep again, cheeks flushed with the effort it takes to be new, and understood something, larger and quieter than any practical concern. The cafe had been given a different kind of work, unasked for and welcome. The wind that night carried one last whisper through the streets of Millhaven before settling into silence, and those who heard it would later swear it sounded like a promise, that some things are too beautiful to be loud, too important to be urgent, and too precious to be anything other than gentle. Ori had arrived not as an interruption to the world's rhythm, but as a reminder of what that rhythm could become when chaos learned to dance to a different song, one measured in kindness rather than cleverness, in connection rather than conquest. The spaces between heartbeats, in the pause before sleep, in the gentle exhale of a universe finally learning to rest, a new story had begun. Not with the sharp crack of breaking reality, but with the soft sound of something settling into place, like a key finding its lock, like a word finding its meaning, like a child finding their home in the warm circle of light cast by a cafe window on a night when the rain had learned to fall gently and the world had remembered how to whisper lullabies. Morning learned the cafe's rhythms quickly, and so did Ori. The days that followed that first lesson with bread and knife moved, like honey through sunlight, each one settling into the next with the unhurried grace of seasons changing their minds. Samuel discovered that caring for a child was less like following instructions and more like learning a new language, one spoken in the tilt of a head, the reach of small fingers toward steam rising from coffee cups, the particular quality of silence that meant contentment versus the different silence that meant something was about to be needed. The cutting board remained on the counter each morning, a promise waiting to be kept, while Ori grew into their limbs and their curiosity. Samuel wore them against his chest in a sling borrowed from Mrs. Chen, one hand steady on the espresso handle, the other steady on the child whose breathing synced itself to the gentle hiss of steam. The cafe itself seemed to exhale into this new rhythm, its familiar sounds softening around the edges like a conversation learning to whisper. Customers spoke softer, without being asked. Chairs made less scrape against the worn wooden floors. Even the milk frothed with a quieter foam, like a lake choosing not to ripple unless a bird wanted to land. The espresso machine, which had always been somewhat temperamental in the mornings, began producing the most perfect shots Samuel had ever pulled, rich and golden, with creamer that lingered like a benediction. People noticed without quite understanding why their morning coffee tasted like it had been made specifically for them, why the bitter edge they'd grown accustomed to had transformed into something that felt like being welcomed home. Mrs. Chen became a fixture of their mornings, arriving with small offerings that seemed to materialize from the same gentle magic that had brought Ori to them. A hand-knitted blanket one day, soft as whispered prayers, a mobile made from pressed flowers the next, each petal holding the memory of summer afternoons. She had appointed herself as Ori's unofficial grandmother, a role she inhabited with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting her entire life for exactly this purpose. She would sit in the booth across from Ori's basket, speaking in soft Mandarin, while her fingers worked at knitting projects that seemed to complete themselves, the words creating a melody that Ori responded to with reaching hands, as if trying to catch the syllables like soap bubbles floating through afternoon light. It was during these morning rituals that Samuel first noticed something unusual about Ori's presence in the cafe. The child watched everything with the particular attention that babies possess, absorb first, decide later, but there was something more. When the sling was traded for a woven blanket in the booth by the window, the world arranged itself into a series of gentle lessons that seemed to flow through Ori's awareness, like water, finding its natural course. Steam raised its hand when it had something to say. Cups announced their needs in the language of temperature. The grinder's growl varied by mood, and in time even Samuel could hear it, though he swore it was Ori who taught him by the way the child's gaze changed. Curious for bright beans, sympathetic for beans too dark, attentive for the rare batch that sounded a little sad and needed to be coaxed rather than commanded. The espresso machine became Ori's first teacher in this subtle language of attention. Its morning grumble, full of purpose and the promise of caffeine, was different from its afternoon sigh when conversations softened and the light stretched long across the floor. Ori would rest a small hand on its warm metal side during quiet moments, feeling its vibrations as if they were a secret code. The machine seemed to respond to this touch, its temperamental nature settling into something more reliable, more generous with its golden creamer and perfect extractions. People started using the cafe as a place to set down what they'd been carrying. Not dramatic burdens, just the daily kind that accumulate like lint in the pockets of ordinary life. A nurse off the night shift, eyes haloed with fatigue, found a corner where the light didn't ask her any questions. A high school student left, a heavy backpack under a table as if it was safe to forget it there for 10 minutes. A mail carrier lingered longer than his route allowed, warming his hands around a mug that fit them the way a well-practiced apology fits into a conversation, reusable, sincere. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. Instead, it unfolded like morning mist lifting from a lake, revealing what had always been there but somehow clearer now, more present. Samuel never called it anything special, but the sign in the window seemed to glow in a way that made people believe they were allowed to arrive a little rumpled and leave a little lighter. It was on a Tuesday morning, when autumn had begun painting the edges of leaves with gentle warnings about winter, that the businessman arrived. He rushed in with his phone pressed to his ear, voice tight with the kind of stress that makes people forget to say please or thank you. Samuel had seen this type before. People who wore their urgency like armor, who treated coffee shops as pit stops rather than places where human beings gathered to be briefly gentle with one another. Double shot, no foam, make it fast, the man barked while pacing near the counter like a caged animal, his conversation full of deadlines and disappointments, his energy crackling with the particular electricity of someone who had forgotten how to be still. But as he waited, something shifted. His pacing gradually slowed, as if the air itself had thickened just enough to require more deliberate movement. His voice, sharp with deadline anxiety just moments before, began to soften around the edges. Ori, awake in their basket by the window, was gazing at the morning light streaming through glass, small fingers opening and closing like someone conducting a very quiet orchestra. The espresso machine hummed its most contented note, and the businessman found himself standing perfectly still, his phone forgotten in his pocket, staring at the scene with an expression of wonder that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else. When Samuel handed him his coffee, which had somehow emerged tasting like comfort itself, like the first warm morning after a long winter, like the kind of embrace that doesn't ask questions, the man looked at him with confusion. He started, then stopped, shaking his head as if trying to clear fog from his thoughts. I haven't felt this calm in months. What is it about this place? Samuel glanced at Ori, who had returned to their quiet observation of dust motes dancing in sunbeams, and felt the truth settle in his chest like a warm stone. I think, he said carefully, some spaces just know how to help people remember how to breathe. This became the pattern of their days. People would enter carrying their daily weight, arguments left unfinished, the accumulated small griefs that city life tends to layer on a person's shoulders, the particular exhaustion that comes from trying to be efficient rather than human. But something about the space itself, something in the quality of light that seemed to bend just slightly around Ori's presence, helped that weight settle into something more manageable. Ori's gift, if it could be called that, wasn't about changing people so much as it was about creating the conditions where people could change themselves, like a tuning fork that helped everything nearby find its proper frequency. If a conversation at table 3 started taking on the brittle edge of two people trying to be right at the same time, Ori would shift slightly in their basket, and somehow a napkin dispenser would catch the light just enough to create a tiny pause, just one sip's worth, that was often enough for someone to remember they had come here to be gentle, not victorious. When Mrs. Chen suffered a morning where the world pressed too hard against her shoulders, Ori's small hand would land on the exact corner of her florist's paper bag just as it was about to tear, and it didn't. When the mail carrier's route changed, and he was forced to learn new doorways, Ori would somehow cause a sugar bowl to slide into his orbit at precisely the moment he needed to laugh at how small comforts can guide you when maps refuse to cooperate. Samuel watched this transformation with the quiet fascination of someone witnessing a miracle that was too subtle to be called miraculous. He began to understand that what he was seeing wasn't supernatural. It was profoundly natural. The way things worked when fear and hurry were gently set aside, when people were given permission to be their better selves. By the time Ori's legs were sturdy and their balance no longer a question, the cafe had adapted to them the way a favorite sweater takes on the shape of its wearer. Small stools appeared, one beside the counter, another by the sink, a third near the shelf where clean cups inverted like a row of simple bells. Samuel discovered that Ori, who could not yet read a menu, could sense the temperature of a mood and answer it with arrangement. They would adjust the position of a chair to angle a view toward the window if someone needed horizon, or tuck it nearer the wall if they needed shelter. They learned how many napkins meant, "I am ready to talk," and how few meant, "Please let me be a quiet stone in a moving stream." The espresso machine became their most willing collaborator in this gentle work. Ori would place their palm on its side and go very still, the way you do when you place your ear against a door before you knock, listening to something that spoke in vibrations rather than words. They learned to count breath in rhythm with the machine's cycles, matching the length of inhale to the open window across the room, matching the exhale to the soft thuds of bread cooling in its pan. On rainy days, the cafe became a harbor where umbrellas leaned toward each other to drip dry, comparing the shape of their spokes the way old friends compare hands. The windows gathered soft fog and wore it modestly, and people discovered they could sit with damp socks over the heat vent without feeling watched. Those who needed to be invisible found invisibility. Those who needed to be seen found eyes that knew how to greet without measuring. It was during one of these gentle storms that a man arrived with a suitcase that had lost a wheel and a face that had mislaid its map. He didn't explain himself. He only set the suitcase down like a tired argument and sat in the booth nearest the window. Ori, now mobile enough to carry small offerings, brought him the only thing they could manage unaided, a square of warm bread, buttered to the edges with the careful attention Samuel had been teaching them. The man looked at the bread as though it had called him by his childhood nickname. He ate every corner with the slow reverence of someone remembering what it felt like to be cared for, and by the time he opened his eyes, the rain had decided to lessen its insistence. He left lighter, even though he still carried the same broken suitcase. And Samuel understood that this was the work they were learning to do together, not fixing what was broken, but offering the kind of nourishment that helped people remember their own capacity for healing. Seasons stacked like coasters, each one teaching Ori new aspects of the cafe's language. They learned that winter light required different arrangements than summer light, that conversations needed more space when people wore heavy coats, that the espresso machine preferred gentler handling when the air was dry and full of static electricity. Mira floated in and out like a beneficial wind, her plants enjoying the cafe so much that they sent tendrils of permission through the door whenever she walked by. She taught Ori the names of leaves the way some people recite constellations. Lemon balm, which calms; thyme, which remembers; rosemary, which clears a path through a tangled mind. Ori hummed the names back, more as feeling than as word, and the herbs seemed to respond, settling into their jar by the register with the contentment of things finding their proper place. The air began to carry that particular peace that comes when growing things are happy, when the boundary between inside and outside becomes permeable to everything except worry. Lullabies, too, became part of the stock, though not the songs themselves, rather their cadence, their rhythm, their gentle insistence that everything would be all right. Samuel found he could steam milk to the beat of "Softly Now" and pull shots to the rhythm of "You're Safe Here." He spoke to Ori the way you speak to someone who can hear things you cannot, asking the espresso machine if it was happy that day and not feeling foolish when the creamer answered yes or no in the language of foam and golden oils. As Ori grew into their gift, for that's what it was, Samuel realized, not a power but a profound attention to the needs of others, the cafe developed rituals around first-time visitors. Ori would watch their hands, noting how tightly they held the strap of a bag or how absent-mindedly they unfolded a scarf, and choose the table that matched the degree of unwind they could achieve. Samuel would watch their eyes and choose a cup accordingly. Some people needed a sturdy mug that felt like a handrail. Others needed something thin and elegant that asked them to slow down lest they spill. Between the two of them, man and child, the cafe guessed needs so gently that people often believed they'd named them themselves. A young woman sat alone one afternoon, trying to swallow news she hadn't wanted, her shoulders curved around a grief too fresh to share. Ori slipped from their corner as if released by the light itself and rested a tiny palm against the warm ceramic of her cup. The woman exhaled a sound that was almost a sob and then wasn't, and later she left a note by the register in careful, ordinary handwriting. "Thank you for letting me be a person today. There was a day when the grinder made a worried sound, a kind of impatient whine that set Samuel's teeth on edge." He banged the hopper, checked the burrs, glanced at the clock as if that would help. Ori put their palm on the side of the machine and went very still, listening to something that spoke in frequencies rather than words. Then they looked up and shook their head once very slightly toward the jar of beans on the back shelf. Not the usual morning blend, but the one Mira had left weeks before, labeled evening, because it made the edges of things agree with each other. Samuel tried a small scoop. The grinder turned docile, the machine purred, the room's shoulders lowered by a quiet inch. Samuel laughed, not because it was funny, but because relief often sounds like laughter, and he didn't know where else to put the feeling of being understood by a child who was teaching him to listen to the voices of things he'd worked with for years without truly hearing. This then was the work of the cafe, to gather arrivals and let them land without breaking, to make kindness such a habit that even the furniture knew it by heart. Ori's gift did not announce itself as power. It moved like a draft under a door, like warmth lingering in a cup after the tea was gone. When a quiet man started leaving crosswords behind with little notes in the margins, "Try 9 down without." Looking it up, you can do it. Ori found the eraser marks before anyone saw them and smoothed them invisible with the edge of a small finger. When two teenagers shyly passed a comic back and forth, pretending not to have drawn it together, Ori arranged the pencils in a jar by their table, as if they'd brought their own bravery, and simply needed a place to set it down. The town noticed without needing to name what was happening. People began to say, "I'll meet you at Samuel's," when what they meant was, "I need a place where my heart won't be asked to hurry." They began to measure time, not just in hours, but in cups poured and conversations paused for the small drama of a drip resolving itself at the spout. Even the stray cat that had claimed the doormat took up a regular shift, learning to blink at arrivals in a way that translated to, "You're fine, go on in." As winter deepened and the windows began to frame snow that fell with the particular gentleness of weather that has learned patience, Samuel realized that Ori was ready for the next lesson. The cutting board had waited through all these months of growth, and now, as the afternoon light slanted through glass made golden by frost, it was time to begin teaching the language that had been waiting beneath all the other languages they'd learned together. "Come here, kid," Samuel said one evening just after the dinner rush that wasn't really a rush, so much as a warm breeze of departures. His voice carried the quiet invitation of someone about to share a secret. "There's a language in this, I think. You're ready to hear." He pulled the familiar stool up beside the counter and placed the cutting board so they could both reach it without strain. The knife lay beside it, sharpened on Sunday mornings with the same attention Samuel brought to tuning the espresso machine. Not just maintenance, but ritual, a conversation between tool and craftsman. "Bread first," he said, pressing a palm lightly to the loaf that had been cooling since morning. "You can tell if it's ready by how it answers. See, it springs back, but it remembers you were there." Ori pressed too, a mirror of his gentleness, and the loaf answered with a soft resilience that made them both smile. Samuel showed them how to listen to a tomato, how to find the line where the knife wanted to go without being forced. He sliced, in patient rounds that looked like stained glass when the late sun came through them, setting out small bowls of salt that tasted of the sea without bitterness, pepper that woke but didn't startle, a whisper of oil, a leaf or two from mirrors, jar that carried the memory of summer, even though it had been grown on a roof in the middle of winter. "You think a sandwich is about hunger?" Samuel said, his hands moving with the same careful attention Ori had learned to bring to arranging napkins and positioning chairs. "But it's really about agreement, layers that don't argue, things that remember how to be together." Ori watched the knife speak in gentle motions, watched the way Samuel placed a slice, and then paused, as if asking it a question before adding the next layer. He built quietly, the way mountains are built by tiny confidences stacked over time, and Ori felt the same stillness they felt when they placed a hand on the espresso machine, the hum that happens when the right task finds the right hands. There, in the lull where day hands itself to evening, the cafe found its next lesson. People would still come to land softly, to set down their bags and their bravado, but soon they would come to be fed in a way that went beyond eating, to receive nourishment that had been layered with the same attention Ori brought to everything else, care made visible, kindness made edible, love translated into the simple architecture of bread and filling and the gentle pressure of hands that knew how to build comfort one layer at a time. The cutting board, freshly wiped, took on the shine of a stage after rehearsal. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new customers, new opportunities to practice this gentle art of feeding people, not just food, but the particular comfort that comes from being seen, understood, and cared for in the most fundamental way possible. For now, Samuel wrapped the practice loaf in cloth so it would not feel alone, and handed Ori a crust still warm enough to steam in the cool evening air. They shared it in companionable silence, leaning against the counter, watching the last customers leave with their coats hugged close and their faces softer than when they'd arrived. Outside, the streetlight flickered once, then steadied, as if agreeing to watch a little longer over this place where arrivals were transformed into soft landings, where the ordinary magic of attention had learned to express itself in the simple, essential act of making sure no one left hungry, not just for food, but for the deeper nourishment that comes from being briefly, perfectly understood. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that quiet space between heartbeats, a path opened gently from the soft landings of arrival to the tender architecture of care, waiting to be walked slice by careful slice, layer by loving layer, one sandwich at a time. By morning, the cutting board had become a kind of page, and Samuel showed Ori how to write on it without letters. The lesson from the night before waited in the grain of the wood, warm to the touch, seasoned by months of gentle use, so they began with the simplest sentence, bread and butter, and learned how even that could be spoken in different tones. Butter that said you are safe when spread all the way to the edges. Butter that said take your time when left in a gentle crescent that allowed the crust to speak for itself. Samuel's hands moved with the patient elegance of someone who believed that care, once taught, would teach in return. He showed Ori how to listen to a loaf of bread not with ears, but with the flat of a palm, feeling its resilience, its internal hum, the way it yielded just so to pressure, like a good secret finally ready to be shared. This, Samuel would say, tapping the crust with a gentle finger, is the foundation. It holds everything. It remembers the sun and the rain and the hands that needed it. It's the first word of comfort. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent years learning that feeding people was about so much more than satisfying hunger. Ori absorbed this lesson not as instruction, but as revelation. When they touched a tomato, it wasn't just a firm red orb. It was a small globe holding the memory of summer warmth, the faint echo of a vine, the promise of a sharp, clean taste that would wake up the palate without startling it. They learned to slice it into rounds so thin they caught the light like stained glass, each one a tiny window into the season that made it. Salt is honesty, Samuel murmured, tapping 2 fingers against a small ceramic pinch pot. Not a shout, just the truth where it's needed. Ori nodded as if the word truth had landed in their chest and made a home there, understanding that some flavors were meant to enhance rather than announce, to support the quiet conversation between ingredients. The knife found its rhythm under Ori's guidance, each slice even and patient. Samuel had learned not to offer corrections unless asked. Ori's instincts had developed their own logic, one that seemed to take into account not just the technical requirements of sandwich construction, but something more subtle, the particular hunger of the person who would receive it. People drifted, in like birds looking for a safe stretch of shore, and the menu behind the counter began to carry phrases that were less recipes and more little promises. Something warm for a cold morning, something crisp for courage, something bright that helps. You remember the way home. No one asked for definitions. They ordered with a glance or a small sigh, or the way their fingers rested over the coins in their pockets, and Ori listened to those cues the way other children listen for the bell at recess. Mrs. Chen arrived first that morning, pink-cheeked. From the chill, a skein of yarn peeking from her bag like a friendly creature. Her hands trembled in the way hands do when they have been useful for a long time, and she looked particularly tired, her usual bright smile dimmed by a restless night. She didn't ask for anything specific, only set her favorite mug on the counter, a quiet request for continuity, for something that would help her feel like herself again. Samuel had been about to make her usual toasted cheese, but Ori, perched on their stool behind the cutting board, gestured toward the thinly sliced turkey, and a sprig of fresh dill from the small pot Mira had left by the window. It was an unusual combination, seemingly mismatched, but Samuel had learned to trust the quiet wisdom he saw in Ori's eyes. Ori worked with deliberate care, choosing the sourdough that Samuel had been nursing for 3 years, the starter so old and reliable it had earned its own name, patience, and a place of honor near the window where it could watch the seasons change. They sliced it thicker than usual, as if Mrs. Chen needed something substantial to hold on to, something that would ground her in the present moment. The turkey was layered with the reverence of someone arranging flowers, each slice positioned, to catch and hold the other flavors without competition. Then came the dill, bright and clean, followed by a thin slice of Swiss cheese that would melt just enough to bind everything together. But it was the final addition that made Samuel pause, a whisper of cranberry sauce from a jar he kept for holiday specials, never for daily use. When Ori presented the sandwich to Mrs. Chen, wrapped in the honest brown paper that had become their signature, she unwrapped it slowly as if she understood that this was not just food but something more deliberate, more intentional. Her first bite was tentative, the way people taste things when they've forgotten how to trust their own hunger. But as the flavors found their way across her palate, The tang of the sourdough, the earthiness of the dill, the gentle bite of the cheese, and underneath it all that unexpected sweetness that tasted like celebration remembered. Something in her face began to change. Her shoulders, which had been carrying some invisible weight, began to lower. Her breathing deepened into something more natural. "This," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "this tastes like my grandmother's kitchen after a long journey home. How did you know?" Ori simply offered a small, knowing smile, the kind that held answers without needing to speak them. They had felt the weariness in Mrs. Chen, the quiet longing for comfort that transcended hunger, and had translated that feeling into layers of bread and filling. From that day forward, the sandwich counter became Ori's domain, a silent workshop of empathy. Before a customer even spoke their order, Ori would often already be reaching for an ingredient, guided by an intuition that felt less like thought and more like a gentle resonance with the needs of others. For the businessman who rushed in every morning with his phone pressed to his ear and stress radiating from him like heat, Ori learned to build sandwiches that were substantial but not heavy, toasted bread for structure, turkey that had been raised on patience rather than antibiotics, avocado that added richness without weight, a touch of mustard that woke up the palate without startling it. The man would eat quickly, as was his nature, but something about the combination would ease the knots in his shoulders, help him remember that efficiency and gentleness were not mutually exclusive. For the elderly gentleman who came in every Thursday afternoon, moving slowly but with dignity, Ori developed softer compositions, bread that didn't require aggressive chewing, flavors that were familiar and comforting rather than adventurous, egg salad made with eggs from chickens that had been allowed to remember they were birds, mixed with just enough mayonnaise to bind without overwhelming, seasoned with herbs that tasted like Sunday afternoons, and conversations that didn't need to go anywhere in particular. The young mother who arrived most mornings with circles under her eyes and a baby who had opinions about everything received sandwiches that could be eaten one-handed, almond butter that had been ground that morning, preserves made from fruit that remembered what season it came from, on bread that had enough substance to satisfy without requiring two hands and complete attention. Samuel watched this education unfold with the quiet pride of someone witnessing a gift discover itself. Ori's hands had learned the weight of ingredients, but more than that, they had learned the weight of need. They could tell by the way someone set down their keys whether they needed something grounding or something that would lift their spirits, whether they needed flavors that would comfort or challenge. When Mira arrived one afternoon with her arms full of new plants, her face bright with discovery, she brought with her an expansion of Ori's palate. "Lemon balm," she announced, setting a pot on the counter. "And this is chamomile, and this little one is mint, but not the kind that takes over everything, the kind that knows how to be gentle." Ori touched each plant with the reverence of someone meeting new teachers, their fingers learning the texture of leaves, the subtle differences in scent, the way each plant seemed to carry its own emotional signature. The lemon balm smelled like sunshine and the kind of laughter that bubbles up without warning. The chamomile carried the essence of bedtime stories and the particular peace that comes just before sleep. The mint was bright but not aggressive, awake but not anxious. Within days, these new additions had found their way into Ori's vocabulary of care. A touch of lemon balm for the woman who came in every morning looking like she was carrying the weight of everyone else's problems. A whisper of chamomile for the man who couldn't seem to stop checking his phone, his anxiety radiating outward, like ripples on a pond. A hint of mint for the college student who fell asleep over her textbooks, needing something to wake her up without making her jittery. The cafe began to hum with a different kind of energy. People started saying things like, "I don't know what it is about the food here, but it always seems to be exactly what I need." They would arrive feeling one way and leave feeling different, not dramatically changed, but shifted, adjusted, like a radio that had been slightly off station and was suddenly receiving the signal clearly. One crisp afternoon, as the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air, a young woman with eyes that held the faraway look of someone who spent too much time dreaming came into the cafe. She ordered a simple tea, her voice soft, almost a whisper, as if she didn't want to disturb the gentle quiet that had settled over the afternoon like a comfortable blanket. Ori watched her settle into the booth by the window. Then, without a word, began to prepare something that wasn't on any menu. They chose a thin slice of rye bread, spread it with cream cheese as light as a cloud, then carefully placed a single delicate sprig of fresh mint from Mira's collection. It was barely a sandwich at all, more like a small edible poem written in the language of comfort. When Samuel brought it to her table along with her tea, the young woman looked at it with surprise, then at Ori, who was watching from behind. The counter with the quiet attention of someone who had learned to listen with their whole being. She picked up the tiny creation, inhaled the cool, fresh scent of mint, and took a bite. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that seemed to unfold from deep within, like a flower opening to the sun after a long night. "It tastes like a forgotten dream," she whispered, her eyes still on Ori. "Like the part you remember just before you wake up." Ori nodded, a barely perceptible dip of their head, as if to say, "Yes, I heard it." The young woman stayed for hours, not speaking much, but occasionally tracing patterns in the condensation on her glass, her gaze drifting toward the small, verdant sprig of mint still sitting on the counter. When she left, she placed a drawing on a napkin by the register, a delicate, swirling pattern that looked like a gentle breeze made visible. Samuel tucked the drawing away with the growing collection of small, unspoken affirmations that found their way into the cafe's quiet corners. He understood now that what Ori was learning was not just cooking, but a form of translation, taking the complex language of human need and rendering it into something as simple and essential as bread and filling. Each sandwich was a poem written in flavors, each combination a small act of empathy made edible. The cutting board, worn smooth by months of careful use and seasoned with the oils and juices of countless ingredients, had become sacred space. Ori would stand before it each morning like a pianist approaching keys, fingers flexing slightly as they considered the day's possibilities, the needs they might be called upon to meet. As evening approached and the light began its daily transformation, from gold to amber to the soft blue of approaching night, Samuel would clean the cutting board with the reverence of someone tending an altar. "We don't erase," he would tell Ori, moving the cloth in broad, slow arcs. "We thank and make room." Together they would prepare the space for tomorrow's lessons, tomorrow's opportunities to translate care into something as simple and profound as bread and filling, and the gentle pressure of hands that had learned to build comfort one layer at a time. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that quiet space between heartbeats, Ori's education in the language of care deepened. They had learned to read the stories written in posture and breathing, to understand the needs that people carried in the way they held their coffee cups or chose their tables. Each sandwich had become a response to that story, a small offering of exactly what was needed to help someone continue their narrative with a little more hope, a little more energy, a little more faith in the possibility that they were worthy of being fed well. But as Ori's hands grew more confident with knife and cutting board, as their intuition sharpened like a blade kept lovingly sharp, Samuel sensed that this was only the beginning. The mint sprig that had spoken so eloquently to the dreaming young woman had come from somewhere beyond these walls, from a place where understanding grew not just in hearts and hands, but in soil and sunlight, in the patient alchemy of root and leaf. Soon, he knew, it would be time for Ori to meet the garden where these small miracles began, to learn the deeper grammar of care that grew in earth and air, tended by hands that understood the secret language of growing things. The cutting board gleamed in the evening light, ready for tomorrow's gentle lessons, while upstairs, beyond the ceiling and the ordinary concerns of commerce, a rooftop garden waited in the gathering dusk, its herbs and flowers breathing slowly in the cool air, preparing their own quiet teachings for the child who was learning that love, like bread, rises best when given time and the right conditions to grow. The invitation came not in words, but in the way the mint sprig had trembled in Ori's hands the day before, as if responding to a call from somewhere beyond the cafe's warm walls. Samuel noticed it too, the way Ori's fingers lingered on the herb's leaves, the distant look in their eyes as if they were listening to a conversation only they could hear, When Mira appeared in the doorway that morning, her hair escaping its braid in silver wisps and her hands carrying the honest evidence of earth under her fingernails, Samuel understood that the next lesson had been waiting patiently above their heads all along. "The garden's asking for you," Mira said simply, her voice carrying the same gentle authority that Samuel used when announcing that bread had risen to perfection. She looked directly at Ori with eyes that held the particular brightness of someone who spent their days watching seeds remember how to become themselves. "It's been listening to the work you do down here, and it wants to show you where the flavors begin their journey." Samuel paused in his morning ritual of coaxing the espresso machine to life, understanding without explanation that this was the next chapter in Ori's education. The cutting board would wait. Some lessons could only be learned in sunlight and soil, in the patient conversation between human hands and growing things. He nodded toward the narrow staircase that led to the building's upper floors, stairs that Ori had glimpsed but never climbed, always sensing that something waited up there that would reveal itself when the time was right. The ascent felt like leaving one world and entering another, each step taking them further from the familiar rhythms of steam and conversation toward something that hummed with a different kind of life. The air grew lighter as they climbed, touched with the green scent of chlorophyll and the earthy promise of things taking root. When Mira pushed open the door at the top, a door that had been painted the color of deep moss and seemed to exhale the breath of growing things, Ori stepped into a space that existed in gentle defiance of everything the city had taught them about the limitations of rooftops and urban soil. Mira's garden spread before them like a secret that had been kept lovingly for years, waiting for exactly this moment to reveal itself. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of the cafe below, but it felt infinite in the way that meaningful spaces always do, every corner holding discoveries that seemed to unfold the longer you looked. Raised beds built from weathered wood held soil so dark and rich it looked like it could grow dreams if you planted them carefully enough. Trellises made from branches chosen for their natural curves supported vines that climbed toward the sky, with the confidence of things that knew they belonged exactly where they were. But it was the gentle impossibility of it all that made Ori's breath catch. Plants that should never have survived a city winter grew with the lush abundance of perpetual spring. Herbs that belonged to different seasons shared space in companionable harmony, their leaves bright with the kind of vitality that usually required months of patient tending. A patch of lavender glowed faintly in the morning light, as if it had captured pieces of sunset and was saving them for evening. Marigolds bloomed in a color so vibrant it seemed to hum with its own frequency, a warm golden note that made the air around them feel like laughter. "How?" Ori whispered, their voice small in the face of such gentle impossibility. Mira smiled, kneeling beside a bed where lemon balm grew in enthusiastic profusion, its leaves releasing their citrusy sweetness into the morning air. Her hair was held back with what had once been a fork, now missing a tine and repurposed with the practical poetry of someone who saw potential in broken things. "The same way you make sandwiches that taste like exactly what someone needs," she said, her fingers brushing the plant's surface with the reverence of someone greeting an old friend. "You listen, you pay attention, you give things what they need to become their best selves." She guided Ori to a patch of soil that lay ready for planting, dark earth that seemed to pulse with potential. "Plants are like people," Mira explained, sinking her hands into the soil as if she were shaking hands with the earth itself. "They respond to attention, to care, to the belief that they have something beautiful to offer the world. Some need more sun, some prefer shade, some like to be left alone to find their own way, others thrive when they're tended constantly. The trick is learning to hear what each one is asking for." Ori knelt beside her, their small hands following her example, fingers disappearing into soil that felt alive with possibility. It was warm despite the cool morning air, and it seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched their heartbeat, as if the garden existed in harmony with every living thing that entered its boundaries. The sensation traveled up Ori's arms and settled in their chest, the same feeling they got when their hands found the right rhythm with the espresso machine, when ingredients arranged themselves into perfect harmony on the cutting board. Mira showed them how to read the language written in leaves, the way a plant's posture could tell you whether it was thirsty or content, how the color of its foliage revealed whether it was receiving too much sun or not enough, how the very air around. Certain plants seemed to shimmer with health, while others called out quietly for attention. She taught Ori to feel the subtle differences in soil texture, how earth that was ready for planting felt different under the fingers than soil that needed more time to prepare itself. "This is chamomile," Mira said, guiding Ori's hand to a plant, whose small daisy-like flowers seemed to glow in the morning light. "It teaches peace. Not the kind that comes from avoiding difficulty, but the kind that comes from knowing you can weather whatever storms arrive." When Ori touched the delicate petals, they felt a wave of profound calm wash over them, like being wrapped in the softest blanket on the quietest night. They moved through the garden like readers moving through a beloved book, each plant revealing its own story, its own gifts. The basil that had called to Ori through the cafe window grew in a corner where it could catch the morning sun, its leaves so intensely green they seemed to contain their own weather. When Mira picked a single leaf and placed it on Ori's tongue, the flavor exploded with the essence of summer afternoons and the particular joy that comes from tasting something at the moment of its perfect ripeness. "Taste is just one language," Mira explained, watching Ori's eyes widen with the complexity of flavors dancing across their palate. "But plants speak in color and scent, and the way they make you feel when you're near them. Some carry memories. This rosemary remembers every hand that's ever tended it, every meal it's ever seasoned, every moment it's helped someone remember something they thought they'd lost." Ori reached out to touch the rosemary, its needle-like leaves releasing their sharp, clean scent into the air. For a moment, they felt dizzy with the rush of sensations. Not just the herb's distinctive aroma, but something deeper, a sense of continuity that stretched back through time, connecting this moment to countless others when hands had reached out to gather herbs for healing, for cooking, for the simple pleasure of bringing something growing into the realm of human care. In one corner, Mira kept a shallow bowl made of clay, so old it seemed to remember when the earth was young. "Moonlight water," she explained, her voice soft with reverence. "It collects here overnight and somehow it's different from rain or tap water. A drop or two in tea helps people remember how to sleep, how to let their minds grow quiet." The water in the bowl was so clear, it seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. And when Ori leaned over to look, they saw their own face and the sky together, a child and a blue that went on forever. The garden revealed its secrets slowly, the way trust builds between new friends. Mira showed Ori how mint needed boundaries, not punishment, but protection for the other plants that couldn't match its enthusiasm for spreading. How sage sat like a wise elder, offering its earthy wisdom to anyone who approached with respect. How the beans along the far trellis climbed like shy acrobats, uncertain until they found their rhythm, and then unstoppable in their reach toward light. "The best way to help something grow," Mira mused, her voice soft as the brush of leaves in a gentle breeze, "is not to force it, but to provide the conditions for it to choose to flourish. Just like people." As the morning progressed, Ori found themselves moving through the garden with increasing confidence, their hands learning to be gentle but purposeful, their eyes beginning to see the subtle signs that Mira pointed out. When a tomato plant's lower leaves showed the faintest yellow tinge, Ori noticed before being told. When the soil around a patch of basil felt too dry, their fingers detected the difference immediately. They worked together in comfortable silence, Ori learning that gardening was as much about knowing when not to interfere as it was about providing care. Some plants needed daily attention, others preferred to be left alone to find their own rhythm. Some thrived on interaction, their leaves seeming to reach toward human hands. Others grew best when observed from a respectful distance, their beauty enhanced by a touch of wildness. As the sun climbed higher, Mira led Ori to a corner where seeds waited in small paper envelopes, each one labeled in her careful handwriting. "These are for you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a gift freely given. "Your own corner to tend, where you can learn what it feels like to plant hope and watch it become something beautiful." Ori looked at the packets, morning glories, and nasturtiums, herbs whose names they were just beginning to recognize, flowers that promised colors they had never seen, Growing from earth, they would tend themselves. The responsibility felt enormous and perfect at the same time, like being handed the first page of a story they would write with their own hands in soil and sunlight. When they finally descended the stairs back to the cafe, Ori carried with them more than dirt under their fingernails and the green scent of growing things in their hair. They carried the understanding that the herbs they used in sandwiches were not just ingredients, but living things that had been tended with the same care. They brought to feeding people the connection between garden and kitchen, between soil and sustenance, had revealed itself as a circle of care that encompassed everything from seed to harvest to the moment when flavor met tongue and provided exactly the comfort that was needed. Samuel looked up from the espresso machine as they entered, noting the change in Ori's posture, the way they moved with a new kind of groundedness, as if they had discovered roots of their own. The cafe felt different too. The air seemed to carry a subtle freshness, a sense of quiet vitality that seemed to emanate from the very walls. As the afternoon customers began to arrive, Ori moved between the sandwich counter and the small pots they had arranged on the windowsill, seeds planted that morning already beginning their invisible work of transformation. The herbs they used that day seemed to carry extra brightness, extra life, as if they understood they were part of a larger story now, one that connected the earth above to the nourishment below in an endless cycle of growth and giving. The cutting board gleamed in the afternoon light, ready for the next sandwich, the next opportunity to translate care into something edible and healing. But now it was part of a larger vocabulary, one that included soil and seed, rain and sunshine, the patient tending of things that grew slowly toward the light, reaching always for the possibility of becoming more beautiful, more nourishing, more generous than they had been the day before. In the garden above, Mira continued her quiet work among the impossible plants, tending dreams that had learned to take root in city soil. And as evening approached, a new sound drifted on the gentle breeze, something like tiny bells made of captured starlight, a tinkling melody that spoke of other wonders waiting to be discovered, other souls who understood the music that lived. In the quiet spaces between heartbeats, the cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm Ori's education deepened, rooted now not just in the warm earth of human kindness, but in the literal earth where all nourishment begins, where patience and attention could coax impossible things into bloom, where the simple act of tending something with love could create miracles as natural as sunrise, as necessary as breath. The sound that had been drifting on the evening breeze revealed itself not as distant bells, but as something far more precious and mysterious. It came again as Ori tended their seedlings on the windowsill, a gentle chiming that seemed to rise from the narrow alley beside the cafe, where shadows gathered like old friends sharing secrets. The melody was delicate, almost fragile, like wind chimes made from captured starlight, and it carried with it the sense of something beautiful being carefully preserved. Samuel paused in his closing routine, cloth suspended over the espresso machine, his head tilted toward the sound with the particular attention of someone who had learned to notice when the ordinary world shifted into something more magical. "Do you hear that?" he asked softly, though he could see by the way Ori's hands had gone still over the small pots that they heard it too. Ori moved toward the front window, their bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors, and pressed their palm against the cool glass. The street outside wore its usual evening costume of amber streetlights and the soft glow from neighboring windows. But there was something different about the quality of light tonight, something that made the ordinary seem touched with possibility. That's when they saw her. A small figure sat cross-legged in the narrow space between the cafe and Mrs. Chen's flower shop, surrounded by what looked like a collection of mason jars. That seemed to pulse with their own inner light. She couldn't have been more than 7, with dark hair that caught the streetlight in ways that suggested it had been touched by something more luminous than ordinary sunshine. Her clothes were the practical sort that children wore when they spent their time exploring rather than sitting still. Sturdy boots, leggings with honest holes at the knees, a sweater that had been loved into softness. But it was the jars that captured Ori's attention. Dozens of them, arranged in careful patterns around the child, like a miniature constellation made of captured light. Each jar seemed to contain something that moved and shimmered, something that couldn't quite be seen directly, but glowed at the edges of vision like memories trying to remember themselves. As Ori watched, the child lifted one of the jars to her ear, listened for a moment with the profound concentration of someone receiving important news, then nodded and set it gently back in its place. The bell above the cafe door chimed its welcome as Samuel opened it, and immediately the air inside seemed to brighten, as if the child's presence had adjusted the very quality of light in the room. She looked up and met their eyes through the doorway, her smile immediate and radiant, the kind that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this moment, for exactly these people to notice her. "I'm Luna," she announced, her voice clear and matter-of-fact, as if introductions were simply the polite thing to do when someone had been listening to your work. She began carefully gathering her jars, handling each one with the reverence of someone who understood that what she carried was infinitely precious. "I collect whispers. The wind drops them sometimes, when it's been traveling far and gets tired of carrying them alone." Samuel and Ori exchanged a glance, the kind that passes between people who have learned to recognize magic when it presents itself wearing everyday clothes. Luna's explanation felt both impossible and completely reasonable, the way the best truths often do. As she entered the cafe, her arms full of softly chiming jars, the air itself seemed to settle into a deeper quiet, as if the room were making space for something sacred. "What do they whisper about?" Ori asked, their voice soft with genuine curiosity. They could see now that the light inside each jar was different, some golden like honey, others silver like moonlight on water, still others carrying the deep blue of twilight skies. The glass itself seemed to hum with contained energy, as if whatever lived inside was eager to be heard, but patient enough to wait for the right listener. Luna's face lit up with the joy of someone who had been hoping for exactly this question. She set her collection carefully on the counter and lifted a jar that glowed with warm amber light. "This one carries a lullaby from a dimension where mothers sing their children to sleep with songs about gentle rain and safe harbors," she said, her small hands gentle on the glass. "And this one," she selected another jar, this one filled with light the color of spring leaves, "holds a conversation between two people who learn to love each other's flaws instead of trying to fix them." She moved through her collection like a curator in the world's most unusual museum, each jar holding its own story, its own fragment of beauty salvaged from the infinite conversations that drifted through the spaces between worlds. "The wind picks them up when it travels through other realities," she explained, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "Sometimes it carries them for days before it finds someone who can hear them properly, someone who knows how to keep them safe." Ori reached out tentatively toward one of the jars, then paused, looking to Luna for permission. The child nodded encouragingly, and when Ori's fingers touched the warm glass, they felt a gentle vibration, like the purr of a contented cat or the hum of the espresso machine when it was perfectly calibrated. Inside the jar, something that looked like captured starlight swirled in lazy patterns, and for just a moment Ori could almost hear it, a fragment of conversation in a language they didn't recognize but somehow understood, words that tasted of comfort and forgiveness, and the particular peace that comes after tears have been allowed to fall and dry naturally. "That one's from a world where people say goodbye by promising to remember each other's laughter," Luna explained, watching Ori's expression with the satisfaction of someone sharing a favorite secret. "I found it last week, caught in the branches of the old oak tree across the street. It had been waiting there so long it had started to fade, but I got to it just in time." Samuel prepared hot chocolate without being asked, the kind made with real cream and patience, stirring it with the same gentle attention he brought to everything else. Luna accepted the mug with the grateful politeness of someone who had learned. That kindness was not something to be taken for granted. As she sipped, she told them about her grandmother, who had lived in a house where the walls were lined with shelves of similar jars, each one a repository of beauty salvaged from the wind's long journeys between worlds. "She taught me that every reality has its own music," Luna said, her voice soft with memory. "Some worlds sing loud songs about adventure and conquest, but others hum quiet lullabies about the importance of being gentle. The whispers I collect, they're from the gentle places, the dimensions where people learn to choose love over being right, where intelligence serves kindness instead of the other way around. Ori felt something stir in their chest, a recognition that went deeper than understanding. The cafe had become a gentle place too, a pocket of reality where people could set down their burdens and remember what it felt like to be cared for. Luna's whispers seemed to confirm something they had sensed but never been able to name, that there were infinite ways for the world to be, and some of those ways were softer, kinder, more patient than the harsh realities that seemed to dominate. So many other dimensions. As the evening deepened around them, Luna shared more stories from her collection. There was a jar that held the echo of a grandfather's voice, reading bedtime stories to children who had grown up, but still needed to remember what it felt like to be safe. Another contained the sound of rain falling on a garden where everything grew exactly as it was meant to, without struggle or compromise. One particularly beautiful jar, filled with light that shifted between silver and gold like captured moonbeams, held what Luna described as the sound of someone deciding to forgive themselves. "Would you like to learn to hear them?" Luna asked, her dark eyes bright with possibility. "The whispers, I mean. It's not difficult, but it does require a certain kind of listening, the kind that uses your whole heart instead of just your ears." Samuel and Ori exchanged another glance, and in that look was the recognition that their small family was about to grow, that the cafe's gentle magic was about to expand in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Luna had arrived not as a customer or even as a visitor, but as the next chapter in their education, the teacher who would show them how to hear the music that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. That evening, Luna showed them how to hold a jar to the open window, not to catch. The wind couldn't be caught, but to offer it a resting place. "You listen for the part that isn't air," she said, eyes half closed, head tilted to catch a frequency that Samuel could sense but not hear. "It's the pause right after meaning. That's where whispers live." Ori tried it, their small hands steady, their breath aligned with the cafe's gentle pulse. At first there was only the familiar rhythm, the soft percussion of settling wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then in the delicate interval between one heartbeat and the next, Ori felt something graze past their ear, familiar as the syllable they'd once felt in a storm. A fragment of almost, a thought that had wanted to become sound and had lost its nerve. They angled the jar not to trap, but to welcome, and a faint luminescence unfolded inside, like the first firefly of summer deciding the dusk was safe. From that night forward, Luna became a regular presence in the cafe, not every day, but whenever the wind carried a particularly interesting collection of whispers. She would arrive with her satchel of glowing jars, her presence adding another layer of gentle mystery to the already unique atmosphere they had created together. Samuel found a special shelf for Luna's collection, near the window where the morning light could catch them, and where the cafe's warmth seemed to amplify their subtle glow. Customers drawn by the unusual sight would often ask about the jars. Samuel would simply say, "Those are Luna's. She collects the quiet parts of the world." And most people, sensing the gentle truth in his words, would simply nod, a small smile playing on their lips, perhaps remembering a quiet part of themselves they had forgotten. Ori learned that some of the subtle emotional shifts they felt in the cafe's customers, the sudden release of tension, the unbidden sigh of contentment, were sometimes the echoes of whispers that Luna had just released into the air, gentle interventions that helped the world remember its own capacity for peace. When a particularly harried businessman rushed, in one afternoon, radiating stress like heat, Luna simply held one of her jars near his hand. He paused, his frantic energy settling into something more manageable, and left looking not transformed but reminded of something important he had almost forgotten about the value of stillness. As the last light faded from the autumn, Sky, Ori and Luna sat together in the cafe, the jars on the shelf glowing like a constellation of tiny captured stars. The cafe breathed its quiet evening breath, and the world outside seemed to settle into a deeper calm, as if it too had been soothed by the presence of these gentle souls who understood that some of the most profound truths are not spoken in words, but whispered on the wind, collected in jars and shared in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. The cutting board gleamed in the lamplight, ready for tomorrow's lessons, but now it seemed to carry the promise of something more, not just the translation of care into food, but the possibility of feeding people nourishment that had been seasoned with wisdom, gathered from the wind itself, flavored with the distilled essence of worlds where kindness was the dominant force. Luna's collection had revealed the existence of realities where the story of intelligence and power had been written differently, where brilliance served love rather than ego, where the most important discoveries were made not in laboratories, but in the quiet moments when people chose to be gentle with one another. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, a new chapter began. Tomorrow would bring new lessons in this expanded curriculum of care, new opportunities to learn the language that was spoken in the spaces between words, the music that played in the pauses where the real truth lived. Outside, the wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, and somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter mixed with the soft chiming of glass jars, creating a lullaby that would help the whole town sleep a little more peacefully, dream a little more gently, and wake with the quiet certainty that they lived in a world where whispers were treasured, where fragments of beauty were saved and shared, where someone was always listening for the soft voices that carried the most important truths of all. The whispers Luna had brought into their lives created a new kind of listening, one that reached beyond the gentle chiming of her jars into the deeper territories of what remained unspoken. Morty discovered that silence, like the herbs in Mira's impossible garden, came in many varieties, each with its own texture, its own purpose, its own way of asking to be tended. It began with Mrs. Chen on a morning when Frost had painted delicate, fern patterns across the cafe windows. She arrived earlier than usual, her customary brightness dimmed by something she carried in the careful set of her shoulders, the way her fingers worried the edge of her scarf. When she ordered her usual tea but chose a different booth, one that faced away from the window, as if the morning light was too much to bear, Ori felt it immediately. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of someone enjoying solitude. It was the heavy silence of someone carrying news they didn't know how to share. Ori paused at the sandwich counter, their hands stilling over the familiar ingredients. Luna, arranging her newest collection on the shelf, looked up and met their eyes with a small knowing nod. Instead of Mrs. Chen's customary toast, Ori found themselves preparing something they had never made before. A simple cup of warm milk, heated to the temperature of comfort rather than efficiency, with a single drop of honey that caught the light like a tiny sun. They carried it to Mrs. Chen's table, not as a server bringing an order, but as one person offering another, the kind of sustenance that goes deeper than hunger. Mrs. Chen wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, and in the pause that followed, a pause that stretched like a bridge between what was and what needed to be said, Ori heard it clearly for the first time. Not words, but the shape that words would take if they could find the courage to exist. The silence spoke of loss that was still too fresh to name, of love that would need to find new ways to express itself. Ori didn't speak. They simply placed their small hand over Mrs. Chen's weathered fingers, offering the kind of presence that asks no questions, but promises to witness whatever needs to be shared. "My sister," Mrs. Chen whispered, her voice barely disturbing the air between them. "She's been sick for so long, and yesterday." The sentence dissolved back into silence, but it was a different silence now. Not the heavy quiet of isolation, but the gentler hush of grief that had been acknowledged, witnessed, allowed to exist in the presence of someone who understood that some truths are too tender to be spoken loudly. From that morning forward, Ori's education expanded into this new dimension of listening. Samuel, who had always possessed his own quiet wisdom, became their guide in recognizing the different textures of unspoken communication. "Silence isn't empty," he explained one afternoon as they worked together at the cutting board. "It's fabric you can touch with careful hands. Each kind has its own weave." There was the silence of contemplation, soft and inward, that settled, around customers staring out the window as thoughts formed and decisions crystallized. Ori learned to recognize the delicate shift in posture, the slight relaxing of the jaw, the way someone's gaze would unfocus as they listened to an inner voice. For these moments, Ori would offer something simple and undemanding, a small unsweetened pastry that asked nothing but provided quiet companionship to the thinking mind. Then there was the silence of suppressed emotion, heavier and denser, that often accompanied forced smiles or overly bright greetings. This silence felt like weight, a carefully constructed wall that people erected around themselves. Ori could sense it in the slight tension of shoulders, the restless drumming of fingers, the micro pause before someone answered a simple question. For these silences, they would build sandwiches with layers of familiar comfort, grilled cheese that tasted like childhood, tomato soup that warmed from the inside out, providing gentle heat that invited carefully constructed walls to soften. The espresso machine became Ori's most reliable teacher in this new language. They would place their palm against its warm metal side, counting the hush between cycles, feeling where the breath wanted to settle. There was a difference between the silence you make by holding your tongue and the silence that arrives because you've laid down your urgency. When customers began to lean into that piece without quite knowing why, the cafe's work grew both lighter and deeper. Mira brought her own understanding to these lessons when she visited the garden. "The silence in soil isn't empty," she explained, guiding Ori's hands into the rich earth. "It's full of roots reaching, seeds dreaming, water moving. It's a busy silence, a growing silence." Ori learned to feel the difference between the expectant silence of a newly planted seed and the robust, confident silence of a plant deeply rooted and thriving. They began to understand that listening to silence wasn't just about people, but about the whole living world, a continuous, unspoken dialogue that nourished everything. One blustery afternoon, a young artist sat hunched over a sketchbook, his silence a palpable frustration. He ordered nothing, just stared at a blank page while creative block settled over him like a heavy cloak. The silence around him was thick with unexpressed potential, with colors and forms that refused to emerge. Ori watched him, sensing the internal battle between fierce desire to create and paralyzing self-doubt. Moving quietly to the counter, Ori chose a small, smooth river stone from Samuel's collection by the register, stones worn round by years of patient tumbling. They placed it gently on the artist's table, not in front of him but slightly to the side near his hand. The artist looked up, surprised, then down at the stone. It was cool and solid, ancient and unassuming. As he picked it up, turned it over, in his fingers, feeling its weight and unblemished surface, the thick silence around him began to thin. He didn't draw the stone, but as he continued to hold it, his gaze drifted back to the blank page and slowly, tentatively, his pencil began to move, not creating a grand scene, but finding its way into the silence with a simple, elegant line. Luna, observing from her perch by the window, gave Ori a small approving nod. "You heard the part that wanted to begin again," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cafe's gentle hum. As the seasons turned and Ori's abilities deepened, they learned that their gift wasn't about solving people's problems or forcing solutions. Like a gentle architect of emotions, they could smooth the rough edges of a moment, provide soft landing for troubled thoughts, or subtly shift the atmosphere to make room for hesitant hope to take root. Sometimes the most profound act of kindness was simply to hold space for someone, to listen to their silence and to offer a small, unspoken gesture that affirmed their presence and worth. The cutting board became not just a place for preparing food, but a space for meditation, a surface where Ori could center themselves and listen to what the day was asking of them. Each sandwich became an offering shaped by this deeper listening, ingredients chosen not just for flavors, but for their ability to provide nourishment that fed more than hunger, that addressed needs people carried in silences they couldn't yet speak. When the elderly gentleman who came every Thursday began carrying a different quality of quiet, not comfortable peace, but the heavier hush of someone preparing for difficult goodbyes, Ori heard it immediately. His sandwich that day was built with extra tenderness, each layer placed with reverence, a way of saying, "You are seen, you are valued, you are not alone in whatever you're carrying." As evening approached and Dr. Martinez from the medical center stopped by the garden fence, he mentioned something that made Luna's eyes brighten with anticipation. "The meteor shower will be visible Friday," he said, glancing toward the cafe as if the weather took suggestions from places that practiced quiet. "We used to listen for them when I was a kid. The hush before the streak, you know, like the sky." Taking notes, Luna looked up from her seed sorting with sudden interest. "Stars sing if you don't talk over them," she said, as if reciting family lore. "They hum mostly. The bright ones are shy about being heard." She turned to Ori with seriousness that held a grin underneath. "You've been practicing." The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, Ori's education in the art of listening deepened. They had learned that silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of possibility, the space where understanding could take root and grow into something beautiful. Each day brought new opportunities to practice this gentle skill, new chances to offer the kind of attention that helped people feel heard, even when they couldn't find words for what they needed to say. As Ori cleaned the cutting board that evening, they understood they were preparing not just a surface for tomorrow's work, but a sacred space where listening and nourishment would continue to transform into something that fed both body and soul. The cafe hummed its quiet evening song, and somewhere in the distance, Luna's whispers chimed their gentle approval, adding their voice to the growing symphony of care that was learning to express itself in the language of silence made meaningful, quiet made full, and the profound understanding that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words at all. Outside, the wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, and above, the stars waited patiently for Friday's arrival, ready to teach their own lessons about the music that lives in the spaces between heartbeats, in the gentle pause where all the most beautiful truths learn to make themselves known. Friday arrived like a promise spoken softly, and the town seemed to hold itself a touch differently all day, as if everyone had agreed to walk more gently so the night could hear its own music. The anticipation that Dr. Martinez had planted with his casual mention of the meteor shower had taken root in the cafe's regular rhythms, growing into something that felt less like an event and more like a gentle invitation from the universe itself. The cafe closed early without announcement, the decision forming naturally as the afternoon light began its daily transformation from gold to amber. Samuel moved through his closing routine with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, but there was something different in the air, a quality of expectation that made even ordinary tasks feel ceremonial. Ori helped arrange thermoses filled with Mira's chamomile tea, each one warm to the temperature of comfort rather than efficiency, while Luna polished her whisper jars with a cloth so soft it might have been woven from captured moonbeams. "The stars have been preparing all day," Luna announced with the matter-of-fact certainty that had become her signature. "I can hear them humming just beneath the daylight, getting ready to sing properly once the sun gives them permission." She held up one of her jars, and in the late afternoon light, Ori could see something swirling inside like captured starlight waiting to be released. They climbed to Mira's rooftop garden as the first stars began their tentative appearance, the familiar staircase feeling like a pathway between worlds. The garden at night revealed itself as a completely different creature from its daytime self. The plants seemed to exhale their stored sunlight in gentle sighs, creating an atmosphere that felt both grounded in earth and open to sky, as if the boundary between growing things and infinite space had become permeable to wonder. Neighbors arrived without invitation, drawn by the same quiet magnetism that had always surrounded the cafe's gentle magic. Mrs. Chen appeared carrying a thermos of her own, tea made with herbs, from her flower shop, that she said helped people remember how to dream in color. The elderly gentleman who had become their Thursday regular settled onto one of Mira's blankets with the satisfied sigh of someone who had found exactly where he belonged. Even the businessman whose mornings had been transformed by Ori's sandwiches climbed the stairs, his usual urgency replaced by something softer, more curious. Dr. Martinez brought not equipment, but simply his own quiet excitement and stories of meteor showers he had watched as a child, when the night sky felt like a vast picture book written in languages of light. As full darkness settled over the town like a comfortable blanket, the small gathering arranged itself with the natural ease of people who had learned to recognize when something beautiful was being offered. The first meteor, announced itself not, with fanfare but with a whisper of light that drew collective gasps from the watchers, a brief, brilliant streak that seemed to write a word in pure luminescence before dissolving back into darkness. In the silence that followed, something extraordinary happened. The night itself seemed to deepen, not into emptiness, but into a profound fullness, as if the meteor had opened a door between the visible world and something infinitely more vast. Luna lifted one of her jars to her ear, her face bright with recognition. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the crystalline quiet. "The stars are singing their lullabies now." Ori closed their eyes and listened with the same quality of attention they brought to the espresso machine's subtle moods, to the unspoken needs of cafe customers, to the growing whispers of Mira's impossible plants. At first, there was only the familiar night chorus, wind through leaves, the distant murmur of the town settling into sleep. But gradually, in the spaces between these earthly sounds, something else emerged. It wasn't quite music, and it wasn't quite silence. It was a frequency that seemed to resonate in the chest rather than the ears, a gentle vibration that felt like the universe humming a lullaby to itself. Ori felt their gift expanding in ways they had never imagined possible, the same sensitivity that allowed them to smooth the rough edges of human emotion, now opening to encompass this vast cosmic conversation. As more meteors traced their brief, brilliant paths across the darkness, Ori sensed the exact moment when everyone's breath caught, when wonder synchronized across multiple hearts. They could feel the collective amazement weaving together into something larger and more beautiful than the sum of its parts. Without conscious effort, Ori began to do what they had learned to do in the cafe. They smoothed, not to change anyone, but to help the night's lullaby reach every pair of shoulders that needed lowering, every heart that wanted permission to soften. Mrs. Chen reached out and took Ori's hand, her fingers warm despite the cool night air. "My sister would have loved this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion but clear with acceptance. "She always said the stars were having conversations we weren't patient enough to hear." As she spoke, another meteor traced its path across the sky, and in its wake, the star song seemed to grow stronger, more distinct. The young mother who had arrived carrying her sleeping baby found herself swaying gently, both she and her child breathing in rhythm with the falling stars, wrapped in a shared moment of profound peace. The businessman, stripped of his usual armor of efficiency, thought not about deadlines but about his daughter, asleep across town, and how he would tell her tomorrow about the night the stars sang lullabies. Luna's whisper jars began to glow, more brightly, as if responding to the celestial display. "They're collecting the star songs," she explained, her voice filled with quiet awe. "The whispers that fall with the light. Tomorrow, when we open them, we'll be able to share this moment with people who need to remember that beauty exists." Dr. Martinez, who spent his professional life dealing with the harsh realities of illness and injury, felt tears on his cheeks as the meteor shower became a symphony of light and silence, each streak adding its voice to a cosmic chorus that seemed to sing directly to the parts of him that had forgotten how to hope. "This is why we stay alive," he whispered to the night sky, "for moments like this." As the meteor shower reached its gentle peak, the star song became unmistakable, a rhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from the darkness itself, as if the space between stars was not empty, but full of music too subtle for ordinary listening. Mira's plants swayed slightly in the still air, as if dancing to a rhythm only they could fully perceive, releasing their fragrances more generously into the night. Ori understood, in that moment of perfect listening, that this was what their gift had been preparing them for, not just the ability to comfort individuals, but the capacity to help create moments when people could remember their connection to something larger, more beautiful, more generous than their individual struggles. The cafe had been their classroom, but this was their graduation into a larger curriculum of care that encompassed the universe's own yearning for witness, for appreciation, for the kind of attention that transforms observation into communion. When the meteor shower finally began to fade, the watchers remained on their blankets for a long time, reluctant to break the spell that had woven them together. The star song continued, softer now but still audible to hearts that had learned to listen. As they finally gathered their blankets and thermoses, moving with the careful quiet of people who had been changed by beauty, each person carried with them not just the memory of falling stars, but the deeper understanding that they lived in, a universe that still knew how to sing lullabies. The cafe below waited in patient darkness, its cutting board and espresso machine somehow changed by the evening's revelations, ready to serve not just food and drink, but the deeper sustenance that comes from remembering one's place in the vast, singing universe. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new opportunities to practice this expanded understanding of what it meant to nourish others, to feed not just hunger, but the soul's need for beauty, wonder, and the quiet certainty that even in the infinite darkness, there was always a gentle song playing for those who had learned to listen. The morning after the stars sang their lullabies arrived wearing a different quality of light, as if the meteor shower had left traces of cosmic dust that made even ordinary sunbeams shimmer with possibility. The cafe breathed with a deeper rhythm, and Ori moved through their morning preparations with hands that still hummed with the memory of celestial music, their sensitivity heightened by the night's revelations into something that felt both more grounded and more expansive than before. Samuel noticed it immediately in the way Ori approached the cutting board, not just with their usual careful attention, but with a profound understanding that their work had evolved beyond feeding hunger into something that could nourish the deeper hungers of the heart. The espresso machine seemed to purr with contentment, responding to this shift with the most perfect extractions Samuel had ever witnessed, each shot emerging golden and rich, as if the machine itself had learned to listen to the cosmic frequencies that still echoed in the morning air. Luna arrived early, her whisper jars glowing more brightly than usual, as if they had absorbed some of the star song's luminescence. She arranged them on their special shelf, with the reverence of someone tending a collection of captured prayers, each jar pulsing gently with light that seemed to respond to the cafe's transformed atmosphere. It was just after the breakfast rush had settled into the cafe's familiar mid-morning quiet when the door chimed to admit a figure who seemed to carry weather on his shoulders. The man who entered moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had been walking too long on roads that led nowhere he wanted to go. His coat bore the honest dust of many miles, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical fatigue, but from the endless work of carrying grief. He was a traveling merchant, though not one Samuel recognized from the usual circuit of vendors who passed through Millhaven. His leather satchel was patched with fabric squares from distant places, each patch telling its own story of markets visited and goods traded. But there was something in his posture that spoke of losses that couldn't be measured in coins or inventory. When he settled into the booth by the window, his movements carried the weight of someone who had been searching for something he couldn't name and was beginning to fear he might never find. Ori felt it immediately, a silence so dense with unexpressed sorrow that it seemed to bend the light around him. This wasn't the contemplative quiet of someone thinking through a decision, or the frustrated hush of creative block. This was the hollow echo of something precious having been taken away, leaving only the shape of what was missing. The man ordered, "Coffee, black." His voice hoarse with the particular kind of tiredness that sleep couldn't cure. As Samuel moved toward the espresso machine, Ori found themselves drawn to the cutting board with a sense of purpose that felt almost urgent. The star songs had taught them to listen to the vast cosmic conversation, but this morning they understood that their gift was meant to translate that celestial music into something tangible, something that could reach the places where words failed to provide comfort. The bread they chose was the dark rye Samuel had been nurturing alongside his sourdough starter. Bread with substance and earthiness, the kind that tasted of resilience and long journeys. They sliced it thin but not fragile, each piece sturdy enough to hold what needed to be carried. The texture spoke of endurance, of the ability to sustain someone through difficult passages. For the filling, Ori's hands moved with the same intuitive certainty they had learned to trust completely, but now guided by an understanding that went deeper than flavor combinations. They spread a thin layer of cream cheese, cool and gentle, like a soft place for wounded spirits to rest. Then came turkey, but not the usual thick slices. Instead, they separated it into delicate shreds that would dissolve almost immediately on the tongue, requiring no effort from someone whose energy was already depleted by grief. But it was the herbs that transformed the sandwich from food into medicine. From Mira's impossible garden, Ori chose rosemary for remembrance, its needle-like leaves releasing their sharp, clean scent when bruised gently between their fingers. They scattered it like a blessing over the turkey, each piece carrying the promise that love endures beyond physical presence. A whisper of fresh dill followed, bright and clean, tasting of spring mornings and the particular comfort that comes from being cared for by someone who understands the language of gentle attention. The final touch came from Samuel's special collection, a small jar of honey infused with lavender, made by an old beekeeper who lived at the edge of the county and understood that some sweetness was meant for healing rather than indulgence. Ori drizzled just enough to add a note that tasted like being tucked into bed by loving hands, like voices promising that everything would be all right. As Ori worked, the cafe seemed to hold its breath, even the usual morning sounds, the gentle hiss of steam, the soft percussion of cups being arranging themselves into a supportive chorus for the delicate alchemy taking place. Luna watched from her corner with the quiet intensity of someone witnessing something sacred, her whisper jars pulsing more brightly as if responding to the careful translation of empathy into sustenance. When the sandwich was complete, Ori wrapped it in brown paper but left it slightly open, as if it needed to breathe, needed to continue its quiet work even while contained. They carried it to the merchant's table, not as a server delivering an order, but as one person offering another the kind of gift that asks nothing in return except the willingness to receive it. The man looked up as Ori approached, confusion flickering across features etched with lines that spoke of too many disappointments. "I didn't order," he began, but something in Ori's expression stopped him. They set the wrapped sandwich beside his coffee cup, their small hand resting briefly on the brown paper, in a gesture that somehow conveyed more than words could manage. "It's not for sale," Ori said quietly, their voice carrying the same gentle authority Samuel used when announcing that bread had risen to perfection. "It's for whatever you've been carrying that's too heavy to carry alone." The man's eyes filled with tears so suddenly that he seemed surprised by them himself. He unwrapped the sandwich slowly, as if he understood that this was not just food but something more intentional, more sacred. The scent that rose to meet him, rye and rosemary, the clean brightness of dill, the subtle sweetness of lavender honey, seemed to unlock something in him that had been held too tightly for too long. When he took his first bite, the careful layers of flavor seemed to speak directly to the parts of him that had forgotten how to be comforted. The rosemary awakened memories of a small garden where someone he loved had taught him the names of herbs. The dill carried the essence of spring, mornings when the world had felt full of possibility. The honey whispered of being cared for, of hands that had learned to be gentle with wounded things. He ate slowly, reverently, and with each bite, something in his posture began to change. The rigid set of his shoulders softened. His breathing deepened from the shallow panting of chronic pain to something more natural, more restful. By the time he had finished half the sandwich, tears were flowing freely down his cheeks, but they were different tears now. Not the bitter salt of despair, but the cleaner flow of grief that had finally found permission to move. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice thick but clearer than it had been when he first spoke. "I lost her 8 months ago, an illness that took too long and hurt too much. I've been traveling ever since, trying to find, I don't know what, a place that didn't echo with her absence, but this—" He gestured toward the half-eaten sandwich, his hand trembling slightly. "This tastes like the last meal we shared. Soup and sandwiches on her good day, when she could still laugh about my terrible cooking. She said the secret ingredient was paying attention to what people needed, not just what they wanted." Luna appeared at their table, carrying one of her whisper jars, this one filled with light the color of dawn breaking over calm water. "This one carries a conversation between a father and daughter who learned that love doesn't end when we can't see it anymore," she said softly, setting the jar where its warm light could reach the man's hands. "Here, it's yours if you'd like to keep it." Sometimes the whispers help us remember that some connections are stronger than distance. The man cradled the jar like it contained his most precious memories, its gentle glow reflecting in eyes that had rediscovered the possibility of wonder. "How did you know?" he asked, looking between Ori and Luna with something approaching awe. "The same way we know when the bread is ready to be shared," Ori replied simply. "We listen to what needs to be heard." Samuel appeared with a thermos of Mira's chamomile tea and a small bag containing another sandwich, wrapped for travel. "For the road ahead," he said gently. "When you need to remember that there are still places in the world where people understand, that feeding someone is a form of love." The man stayed for another hour, not talking much but simply existing in the cafe's gentle embrace, the whisper jar glowing softly in his hands while the morning light grew stronger around them. When he finally gathered his belongings to leave, he moved differently, not healed because some wounds are too deep for healing, but held, supported by the understanding that his grief was witnessed and honored, that his love for his daughter was seen and celebrated. Before departing, he reached into his satchel and withdrew a small, intricately carved wooden bird, worn smooth by years of handling. He placed it gently on the counter beside Ori's cutting board. "She made this," he said simply, "in one of her art classes before she got too sick to hold the tools. I've been carrying it everywhere, but I think it wants to stay somewhere." That understands what it means to create beautiful things with careful hands. After he left, the cafe settled into its usual rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted. The cutting board seemed to gleam with a deeper purpose. The ingredients on the shelves carried more weight, more possibility. Ori understood that their education had reached a new level. They had learned not just to feed hunger, but to nourish the specific hungers of the heart, to translate empathy into sustenance that could reach the places where words failed to provide comfort. Samuel placed the wooden bird carefully on the shelf near Luna's whispers, where it caught the morning light and seemed to sing its own quiet song of love remembered and honored. "Some days," he said quietly, cleaning the cutting board with extra reverence, "we get to be part of someone's healing, not the whole thing, just a piece. But sometimes a piece is enough to help someone remember they're not alone in their love." The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm Ori's understanding deepened. They had learned that sandwiches could indeed become medicine, that the careful layering of ingredients chosen with love could create something that nourished not just the body, but the soul, that fed not just hunger, but the deeper need to be, seen, understood, and cared for in the most fundamental way possible. Outside, the morning continued its gentle unfolding, and somewhere on the highway, a man drove with a whisper jar glowing on his passenger seat and the taste of love still lingering on his tongue, carrying with him the knowledge that there were still places in the world where strangers could recognize your pain and respond with exactly the kind of tenderness your heart needed to continue beating. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the light and held it, a reminder that some gifts are meant to be shared, that love finds its way into the world through the careful attention of hands that understand the sacred work of feeding both body and spirit, one gentle sandwich at a time. The wooden bird's quiet presence on the shelf seemed to have awakened something in the very air of the cafe, its carved wings catching the morning light in ways that suggested it carried more than memory. It held the essence of love, transformed into something tangible, something that could continue to give comfort long after its creator had moved beyond the reach of ordinary conversation. Ori found themselves drawn to it throughout the morning, their small fingers tracing its smooth curves, while sensing a subtle shift in the cafe's atmosphere, as if the bird's arrival had tuned the space to a frequency that reached beyond the walls and into the impossible garden above. It was Mira who first articulated what Ori had been feeling. She appeared in the doorway just after the lunch crowd had settled into their usual gentle conversations. Her hands still carrying the honest evidence of soil, and her eyes bright with the particular wonder of someone who had witnessed something unprecedented. "The plants have been singing all morning," she announced, her voice soft with amazement. Not their usual green whispers, but something more deliberate, more purposeful. "I think they heard what happened down here." Samuel looked up from the espresso machine, noting the way Mira's gaze kept drifting toward the wooden bird, and nodded with the understanding of someone who had learned to recognize when the next lesson was ready to reveal itself. Luna, arranging. Her whisper jars with their newly intensified glow smiled knowingly. "The garden's always been alive," she said, "but today it feels awake, like it's been waiting for the right moment to speak more clearly." The climb to the rooftop felt different this time, each step carrying Ori not just physically upward, but into a deeper understanding of the connections that wove through their expanding world. The air grew lighter as they ascended, touched with the green scent of chlorophyll and something else, a quality of attention that felt almost electric, as if the very atmosphere was listening with the same intensity Ori brought to reading the unspoken needs of cafe customers. When they stepped onto the rooftop, the change Mira had described was immediately apparent. The garden hummed with an energy that was both more vibrant and more purposeful than Ori had ever experienced. The plants seemed to lean toward them with an almost eager quality, their leaves catching the light in ways that created subtle patterns of shadow and brilliance across the soil. Even the air felt different, charged with the kind of communication that happens below the threshold of ordinary hearing, thick with conversations conducted in frequencies that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the heart. They responded to this morning's healing, Mira explained, kneeling beside the bed where Ori's first tentative plantings had grown into a lush micro-ecosystem. "The grief you helped transform, the love you made visible in that sandwich, the plants absorbed it all, transformed that emotional energy into physical vitality." She gestured toward a sprig of lavender that had somehow doubled in size overnight, its purple buds swelling with concentrated essence. "They're literally growing on love, on the careful attention you poured into healing a grieving father." Ori knelt beside her, their hands finding the warm earth with the same reverence they brought to the cutting board. As their palms settled against the soil, they felt it immediately, not just the familiar sensation of earth and moisture, but something more complex, more intentional. The ground itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched their heartbeat, and gradually, as they settled into the deeper quality of listening Luna's whispers had taught them, the garden's secret language began to reveal itself. It started as a vibration, so subtle it might have been their own pulse transmitted through their palms into the earth. But as Ori focused their attention with the same careful intensity they brought to reading the silence around cafe customers, the vibration began to differentiate itself into something more complex, more purposeful. Each plant spoke in its own frequency, the basil pulsing with bright, clean notes that tasted of summer mornings and the particular joy of being exactly what you were meant to be. The rosemary humming with deeper, earthier tones that carried memories of every hand that had ever tended it, every meal it had blessed with its presence. "Listen with your whole heart," Mira whispered, her own hands moving gently through the leaves of a tomato plant that had somehow managed to fruit in the cool autumn air. "They don't just respond to water and light, they respond to the emotional climate around them. A plant that feels loved, that feels seen and understood, will always grow stronger, more generous with its gifts." Ori touched a small, struggling seedling whose leaves were curled inward, despite adequate water and sunlight. As their palm settled over its small form, they felt a profound anxiety emanating from it, a fear of not being enough, of not being able to grow. The plant had absorbed worry from somewhere, perhaps from Mira during a week when winter's approach had filled her with concern, and it needed to be told it was safe to unfurl, safe to reach toward the light at its own pace. Closing their eyes, Ori breathed in rhythm with the garden's subtle pulse, imagining the seedling taking a deep, slow breath. They felt warmth transfer from their palm, not just heat, but a quiet reassurance that whispered, "You are enough, you are safe, grow as slowly as you need." Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tiny leaves began to unfurl, testing the air, trusting the gentle promise. This became their shared work. Mira with her deep botanical knowledge and intuitive understanding of plant needs, Ori with their profound empathy and ability to perceive and gently influence the emotional climate. They moved through the beds like two parts of a single harmonious instrument, Mira reading the physical signs, while Ori listened to the emotional undertones that shaped each plant's willingness to thrive. They discovered a patch of mint that seemed to be holding its breath despite ample water, its leaves brittle with tension. When Ori touched it, they felt a frantic, restless energy. "It feels like it's trying too hard," they murmured, sensing the plant's struggle against the wind that hit this corner of the garden. Together they placed a small windbreak, not to stop the air's movement, but to help the mint remember how to dance with the breeze rather than fight it. Within days, the mint softened, its leaves becoming pliable, its scent richer and more generous. Near the garden's heart, they found a rosebush blooming beautifully, but emanating a subtle sadness, its petals holding a wistful longing. When Ori touched a bloom, they felt a deep, quiet yearning. It wants to be given away, they realized, understanding that the plant's generosity was being constrained by having no outlet for its gifts. Mira carefully cut several blooms, arranging them in small vases throughout the cafe, where their beauty brought smiles and gentle sighs throughout the day. Relieved of its burden of unexpressed generosity, the rosebush seemed to bloom even more profusely in the days that followed. Luna appeared with a whisper jar that glowed with light, the color of spring leaves. "This one carries the sound of a garden where everything grows exactly as it's meant to," she announced, setting it carefully among the plants, "where every plant knows its purpose and shares its gifts freely." As the jar settled into place, the garden's song seemed to intensify, the plants swaying slightly in the still air, as if dancing to a rhythm only they could fully perceive. Through these gentle lessons, Ori learned that Mira's garden was not just a collection of plants, but a living sanctuary where the emotional needs of growing things were acknowledged and tended with the same care they brought to cafe customers. The herbs that found their way into sandwiches now carried not just botanical essence, but concentrated healing energy. Mint that had learned to yield rather than fight. Rosemary that remembered every act of love it had witnessed. Chamomile that had absorbed the peaceful energy of the garden's most tranquil corners. Mira began keeping a notebook, its pages softened by countless observations written in her compact handwriting. "Lavender deepens when rain is coming," she would note, or basil lifts when forgiveness is near. She taught Ori to make their own observations, to chart the subtle relationships between human emotion and plant response, understanding that the garden's language was not fixed, but grew with each listener, each act of attention. As evening approached and the light began its daily transformation from gold to amber, Ori understood that they had discovered something profound about the nature of their gift. The same sensitivity that allowed them to smooth the rough edges of human emotion, to create sandwiches that nourished more than hunger, extended into this green realm where attention and care could literally accelerate growth, where love became visible in the form of thriving plants that offered their gifts more generously. The cutting board downstairs seemed to gleam with new purpose when they returned, the wooden bird singing its quiet song of remembered love while Luna's whisper jars pulsed with gentle light. Samuel looked up from his evening preparations, noting the deeper understanding in Ori's expression, the way they moved with the groundedness of someone who had discovered new roots. "Everything's connected," Ori said simply, their hands already moving toward the familiar tools with a new comprehension of the work they were called to do. "The healing we offer feeds the garden, and the garden feeds the healing. It's all one conversation, spoken in different languages." The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, Ori's education deepened into something that encompassed the full circle of care. From the moment intention was planted in fertile soil to the instant when carefully prepared food, touched the tongue of someone who needed exactly that flavor, that comfort, that reminder of their worth. The garden's secret language had revealed itself as part of a larger vocabulary of compassion, one that spoke in soil and sunlight, in herbs and healing, in the endless conversation between human hands and growing things, all of it connected by the simple, profound understanding that love, like plants, grows best when tended with patience, attention, and the quiet faith that beautiful things will emerge when the conditions are right. Above them, the impossible garden settled into its evening. Quiet. Plants breathing slowly in the cool air, their roots deep in soil enriched by every act of kindness that had flowed up from the cafe below. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light of day, its carved wings seeming to flutter with the memory of flight, while somewhere in the distance, the wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, fragments of conversations from dimensions. where love had learned to speak in the language of growing things, where healing flowed as naturally as water from root to leaf, to the hands that knew how to tend both plants and hearts with equal reverence. The wooden bird's presence seemed to have awakened something deeper in Luna's collection, and over the days following their discovery of the garden's secret language, she began to work with her whisper jars in a new way. Instead of simply listening to individual fragments, she started arranging them according to patterns only she could perceive, moving the glowing vessels with the careful attention of someone translating a vast, luminous text that had been written across the spaces between worlds. It was on an evening when autumn rain painted gentle percussion against the cafe windows that Luna spread a piece of soft cloth across the largest table and began to reveal what she had been discovering. The fabric was the color of twilight, woven from threads that seemed to hold their own subtle light, and as she arranged her whisper jars across its surface, each one began to glow more brightly, as if responding to being part of a larger conversation. The whispers have been teaching me something, Luna said, her voice soft with wonder as she positioned a jar that pulsed with warm amber light near another that shimmered with silver radiance. They don't just carry individual stories, they carry coordinates. They're fragments of a map that shows where the gentle worlds are, where kindness learned to be the loudest sound. Ori watched with fascination as Luna worked, her small hands, moving with the same intuitive certainty they brought to the cutting board. She wasn't just arranging jars randomly. She was following connections that existed in frequencies beyond ordinary perception, creating patterns that revealed the hidden geography of compassion across infinite realities. Samuel dimmed the cafe's lights until the space took on the warm, contemplative atmosphere of candlelight, while Mira appeared with strands of dried rosemary and lengths of natural twine that smelled faintly of sunshine and patient hands. She set them beside the cloth, understanding without explanation that Luna's work required the kind of materials that remembered their connection to growing things. This is not a map of places, Luna explained as she began to connect the jars, with delicate threads of light that seemed to emanate from the glass itself. It's a map of ways, of how worlds choose to be with themselves. Each light represents a moment when someone chose gentleness over force, when brilliance decided to serve love instead of conquering it. As Luna worked, touching the rim of one jar and then another to coax faint chimes from the glass, threads of luminescence began to appear between them, as if the air itself were drawing connections. When certain tones brushed against each other, the pathways brightened, and Mira carefully laid rosemary strands along the glowing lines, while Samuel tied the intersections with his sure, gentle knots. Ori felt their breath catch as patterns emerged, constellations of gentleness that revealed the hidden architecture of compassion. Here was a cluster of worlds where people paused before answering difficult questions, where patience had become a form of wisdom. There, a bright pathway connected realities, where elders were listened to as if they were libraries that knew your name, where experience was treasured rather than dismissed. This cluster, Luna said, indicating a dense knot of warm golden light, carries whispers from dimensions where the greatest scientists spend their time figuring out how to make flowers bloom more beautifully, where the most brilliant discoveries are about helping people sleep more peacefully. And this pathway, she traced a silver thread with her finger, connects worlds where intelligence learned to whisper instead of shout, where the smartest person in every family is the one who remembers everyone's birthday and knows exactly what kind of soup will cure any sadness. As the evening deepened around them, Luna continued building her map, each jar adding another point of light, another pathway between realities where different choices had led to different outcomes. She showed them routes between dimensions where portal technology had been developed, not for escape or conquest, but for sharing. Worlds where the ability to travel between realities had been used to carry comfort to places where it was needed most. "There's a version of a great genius," Luna whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she touched a jar that glowed with particularly warm, steady light, who learned to build things that helped people instead of harming them. He spent his brilliance creating lullabies that could reach across dimensions, technology that sang instead of screamed. In his world, The greatest invention was a garden that could feed an entire city with food that tasted like hope. Ori felt something stir deep in their chest, not quite recognition, but a sense of profound rightness, as if Luna's map was revealing connections they had always sensed but never understood. The cafe's gentle magic, the garden's responsive growth, their own ability to smooth the rough edges of human emotion. All of it was part of this larger pattern, this network of realities where kindness had learned to be the dominant force. Luna guided Ori's hand toward a shallow dish of moonlight water from Mira's garden, its surface still as polished silver. "Now you try," she said softly. When Ori's fingertip touched the water, ripples spread outward, and where they intersected with the nearest ring of light, a new pathway brightened on the cloth, linking a jar of twilight blue to one the soft gold of late afternoon. "Some worlds are easy neighbors," Luna murmured, adjusting thread to match the widening glow. "They visit each other through recipes and songs, through the small acts of kindness that travel faster than light, because they don't need to carry the weight of ego or the burden of being right. They worked like this for hours, not hurrying, letting each connection arrive when it was ready." Dr. Martinez stopped by on his way home from the medical center and stood quietly, his hands tucked in his coat pockets, watching the map grow with the wonder of someone witnessing something that confirmed his deepest hopes about the nature of healing. When they marked their own location, Luna didn't place it at the center, which would have been untrue, or at an edge, which would have been lonely. Instead, she set the wooden bird gently on the cloth where several soft lines crossed, pathways of lullaby, of good bread, of healing offered without expectation of return. When the bird's shadow touched 3 of the threads at once, the threads warmed and held steady. "There," Luna said with quiet satisfaction. "Not a star to be wished upon, but a landing strip for those who need a place to rest." The map taught them as they kept it, becoming a living document of the connections between gentle worlds. During quiet mornings, Ori would stand before the cloth and let their gaze rest on a particular cluster until flavors rose in their mouth, like memories from dimensions they had never visited, but somehow knew. The cafe's menu began to shift in subtle ways, sandwiches with unexpected brightness when the pale green cluster of reconciliation glowed stronger, soups that held without constraining when the twilight blues deepened with the energy of worlds. Learning to forgive themselves. Customers began leaving notes that spoke of inexplicable comfort. "Feels like someone wrote me a permission slip to be gentle with myself." The herbs tasted like a conversation I needed to have, but didn't know how to start. Samuel kept these testimonies in a jar near the register, and sometimes Luna would place it on unmarked sections of the cloth to see which pathways responded, with increased luminescence. As the weeks passed, the map revealed its deeper purpose. It wasn't just a chart of gentle realities. It was a working tool for strengthening the connections between them. Every act of kindness in the cafe, every sandwich made with love, every moment of healing offered in their small sanctuary sent ripples along the pathways Luna had made visible, making it easier for compassion to flow between worlds. One night, as rain wove its quiet patterns against the windows, something new appeared on the map, a small, restless flicker of light that pulsed with the quick, brilliant energy of a mind that had grown tired of its own speed. It wasn't the warm, steady glow of established gentleness, but something more urgent, more seeking, like intelligence that had finally realized it was hungry for something other than being right. Luna tilted her head, listening with the profound attention she brought to all her work. "That's a mind looking for a different kind of answer," she said softly, not reaching toward the light but simply resting her palm on the table beside it, offering presence without pressure. A brilliant one that's learned the difference between being clever and being wise. Ori felt the flicker in their own chest, not fear but recognition of the same restless energy they had learned to gentle in cafe customers who carried too much urgency, too much weight, from trying to solve everything through force of intellect alone. Their gift reached toward the quick light and did what it always did. It softened the space around it, not dimming the brilliance, but cushioning it so it could breathe without burning. The light held steady for 2 heartbeats longer than before, and in that brief pause they all understood that someone, somewhere in the vast network of realities, was preparing to make a different choice. Someone was looking for a place where intelligence could rest, where brilliance could serve something larger than itself, where even the most restless mind could learn the gentle art of being still. Samuel began his evening preparations with extra, care-warming tea that remembered summer fields, cutting bread with the particular attention that made each slice align like quiet thoughts. Mira tucked fresh rosemary in a small glass at the edge of the counter, its green promise a soft greeting for whoever might need to remember that some kinds of wisdom grew slowly, rooted in patience rather than speed. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, Luna's map pulsed with quiet anticipation. The pathways between gentle worlds glowed steady and patient, roots of tenderness spanning distances no ordinary vehicle could cross, making welcome without asking anyone to explain why they had come. Outside, the rain finished its thought and rested, while inside the wooden bird kept its faithful watch, wings carved with the memory of flight but content now to serve as anchor point for a network of realities where love had learned to be the most brilliant force of all. The bell above the door made the softest suggestion of sound, and when they looked up, they were ready, not with answers, but with the kind of presence that helped questions transform themselves into something gentler, something that could be nourished rather than solved, something that could finally, after traveling so far through so many harsh realities, learn. To rest in the warm circle of light cast by a cafe where whispers were treasured, where fragments of beauty were saved and shared, where someone was always listening for the soft voices that carried the most important truths between worlds. The bell above the door chimed with an urgency that seemed to bend the very air around it, and the man who entered brought with him the particular weather of a mind that had been moving too fast for too long. His lab coat bore the honest stains of someone who worked with equations that refused to behave, and his eyes carried the restless brilliance of intelligence that had grown tired of its own speed. In his trembling hands, he clutched a device that hummed with barely contained energy, its screen flickering with numbers that writhed like living things seeking escape. "Coffee," he said, his voice hoarse with the particular exhaustion that came from thinking too hard about problems that had no gentle solutions. "Black, strong. And I need to ask you about dimensional fluctuations. There are readings, energy signatures that suggest this location exists in direct contradiction to the chaos that should dominate this reality." He held up the humming device, its display showing waveforms that pulsed with the same restless energy that radiated from his shoulders. Samuel moved toward the espresso machine with his usual unhurried grace, but Ori felt the familiar sensation of someone carrying too much. Weight, not grief this time, but the particular burden of brilliance that had forgotten how to rest. They could sense the layers beneath his scientific urgency, profound loneliness, the isolation that came from being the smartest person in most rooms, and discovering that intelligence without connection was just noise echoing in an empty space. Luna looked up from her twilight map, her dark eyes immediately understanding what she was seeing. "You're searching for the S variable," she said quietly, her small hand resting on a whisper jar that pulsed with restless light. "The dimensional signature of minds that learned to choose chaos over peace, brilliance over kindness. You've been tracking it across realities, trying to find where intelligence remembers to serve something larger than itself." The man's head snapped toward her with the shock of being completely understood by someone who appeared to be no more than 7 years old. "How could you possibly know that? The theoretical framework alone requires—" He stopped, his device's urgent humming seeming to falter as Luna's gentle certainty reached him. "Whispers," Luna said simply, touching her jar with reverence. "The wind carries fragments from all. The realities where that choice was made differently, where brilliance learned to kneel before beauty instead of conquering it." She gestured toward her map of gentle worlds, its pathways pulsing with soft radiance. "You're not the first scientist to come looking for proof that intelligence can exist without causing harm." Samuel set a cup of coffee on the counter, its rich aroma filling the air with the promise of clarity without chaos. But Ori, sensing that caffeine would only amplify the man's frantic energy, moved quietly to where Mira kept her collection of healing herbs. They selected chamomile with the same careful attention they brought to choosing sandwich ingredients, preparing tea that would speak to the parts of him that had forgotten how to be still. The man approached the coffee like someone who had forgotten. That sustenance could be offered without conditions, but when Ori appeared beside him with the steaming mug of chamomile tea, something in his expression shifted. The tea was infused with a single drop of moonlight water from Mira's garden, and the ceramic mug had been chosen for its weight, its ability to ground restless hands. "For your journey," Ori said softly, their voice carrying the same gentle authority. Samuel used when announcing that bread had risen to perfection. Sometimes the most brilliant discoveries happen when we remember that the mind needs rest as much as stimulation. The man looked at the mug with bewildered eyes, as if he'd been offered a flower in the middle of a battle. When he lifted it to his lips, the chamomile's delicate fragrance seemed to unlock something in him that had been held too tightly for too long. His first sip brought a visible softening to his shoulders, a slowing of the rapid breathing that had marked his arrival. "This is—" He paused, struggling to find words for something that existed beyond his usual vocabulary of equations and hypotheses. "The sensory input is unexpectedly soothing. What is this place?" Mira appeared from the garden stairway, her hand still carrying the honest evidence of soil, and her eyes bright with the particular peace that came from spending time among growing things. "Come upstairs," she said in a tone that remembered children and thunderstorms. "The garden has been waiting to meet you. Sometimes the equations we need most are written in leaves and soil." He hesitated in the way of travelers who had survived by not deviating from their path, then nodded. His device, still clutched in his hand, began to emit a different tone as they climbed, less urgent, more curious, as if it too were learning, to ask questions instead of demanding answers. The rooftop garden at twilight revealed itself as a sanctuary where impossible things grew, simply because they were tended with love. The man knelt without being asked, his palm flat against soil that pulsed with the rhythm of growing things. His device's harsh humming softened to something closer to a lullaby, and he frowned at this change, then softened the frown, surprised by his own capacity to yield. "Coherence," he whispered, but the word came out like a prayer instead of a theorem. "I've been trying to model it with equations that don't know how to listen." He watched a seedling unfurl another millimeter in response to Ori's gentle presence. This tiny act of growth solving something he'd been breaking himself against for years. Mira guided his hands into the rich earth, teaching him to feel the difference between soil that was ready for planting and earth that needed more time to prepare itself. "Plants are like people," she explained, her voice soft with years of patient observation. "They respond to attention, to care, to the belief that they have something beautiful to offer the world. The trick is learning to hear what each one is asking for." As the evening deepened around them, the scientist's story emerged in fragments, between sips of chamomile tea and moments of profound stillness. He spoke of laboratories where competition had replaced curiosity, of discoveries that served ego rather than humanity, of the particular loneliness that came from being surrounded by brilliant minds that had forgotten how to be kind. "I've been charting catastrophe attractors," he said, his voice growing softer as the garden's peace settled into his bones. "Places where genius hardens into gravity wells, where intelligence becomes a weapon rather than a gift. But this," he gestured toward Luna's map, visible through the cafe windows below, "this suggests the inverse can be mapped, gentle fixed points where brilliance learns to serve." Luna appeared with a whisper jar that glowed with the steady light of dawn breaking over calm water. "This carries conversations between scientists who discovered that the most elegant equations were the ones that made people feel safe," she said, setting it where its warm radiance could reach his hands. "They learned that true brilliance isn't about being right, it's about being helpful." When sleep found him that night, curled among Mira's impossible plants, with a blanket that remembered many other shoulders, it wasn't an ambush, but a permission. He dreamed with his jaw unclenched for the first time in months. Memories of kitchens where someone had shown him how to cut bread without sawing, where intelligence had learned to whisper instead of shout. He woke with the soft, bewildered look people wear when their body has done them a kindness without asking permission. The garden's morning chorus rose around him, plants singing their quiet harmonies, Luna's jars chiming their gentle approval, the sky's vast silence holding everything like a steady bowl. "I keep trying to repair the engine while it's running," he said, the admission careful as he cradled Mira's morning tea. "Maybe the repair is learning to teach it how to idle." Downstairs, he opened his case with new gentleness, introducing his equipment to the cafe like a guest instead of a weapon. When he held a small induction ring near Samuel's espresso machine, the machine considered the gesture and answered with a tone none of them had ever heard, something between steam and contentment, between precision and peace. The harsh, insistent whine of his device softened to match the cafe's frequency, transforming into something that sounded like a held breath on the verge of song. The screen that had chronicled failure after failure smoothed into a waveform that looked like a resting heart, and he laughed, not in triumph, but with the quiet relief of someone who could finally stop running. "There," he said, eyes shining with new understanding. "A coupling without conquest." As evening approached and the street lamps began their gentle conversation with the first stars, the scientist prepared to continue his journey. But he moved differently now, not with the frantic energy of someone fleeing chaos, but with the measured pace of someone who had remembered that the most important discoveries couldn't be rushed. "If the S variable is anything," he said, pausing at the door with his case held like a promise rather than a burden, "maybe it's not a number. Maybe it's a choice repeated until it looks like law." He looked at Ori with the respect of someone who had been taught without being made to feel small. "Thank you for showing me that intelligence can choose to whisper." After he left, the cafe exhaled the kind of sigh rooms release when a difficult guest departs as a friend. The espresso. Machine kept a little of the new harmony in its voice, adding it to its vocabulary of comfort. On Luna's map, the restless flicker had settled into steady, peaceful light, proof that even the most brilliant minds could learn to rest when offered the right conditions for healing. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light and held, like a promise, while somewhere in the distance a device that had learned gentleness hummed quietly to itself, practicing a language it had just begun to understand. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm another soul had discovered that brilliance need not be a burden, that intelligence could serve love rather than ego, that even the most restless mind could learn the sacred art of being beautifully, peacefully still. The morning after the scientist's gentle departure arrived, wearing the particular quality of light that follows transformation, and Samuel discovered that the espresso machine had learned new songs during the night. Its familiar purr now carried harmonies that seemed to echo the cosmic lullabies from the meteor shower, as if the scientist's device had taught it to listen to frequencies that existed between the spaces of ordinary sound. The first sign of change emerged with the morning's initial pull of espresso. As Samuel worked the familiar levers with his usual careful attention, the crema that rose to greet him bore patterns he had never seen before, not the simple hearts or leaves that baristas learned to coax from steamed milk, but intricate spirals that seemed to hold depth, as if the coffee's golden surface had become a window, looking into somewhere infinitely distant, yet intimately familiar. Ori, arriving early to tend their seedlings on the windowsill, paused at the sight of these unusual formations swirling in the cup. When they breathed in the coffee's aroma, something extraordinary happened. For just a moment, the familiar scent of their morning blend carried undertones of something else entirely. Coffee beans that had been roasted under different stars, in a dimension where morning meant the sound of children laughing without fear, where the first cup of the day tasted like promises, kept rather than promises made. Mrs. Chen arrived first, as she always did, her silver hair catching the early light, and her hands still carrying the gentle grief she had been learning to weave into her daily rhythms. She ordered her usual Earl Grey, but when Samuel handed her the cup, something in the steam's spiral made him pause. "Try this instead," he said softly, offering her the coffee with its mysterious spiraling creamer. She lifted the cup to her lips with the trust of someone who had learned to recognize when small miracles were being offered. Her first sip brought a visible transformation. Her shoulders lowered, her breathing deepened, and her eyes filled not with tears, but with the soft light of recognition. "Oh," she whispered, as if greeting an old friend. "This tastes like the morning after a long journey, when the air is crisp with possibility, and you know you're about to see someone you've missed for a very long time." As she spoke, something shimmered in the air around her table, not visible exactly, but felt like heat waves rising from summer pavement. For just a breath, the cafe seemed to expand beyond its familiar walls, and those watching could almost see the shoreline Mrs. Chen was remembering, a place where someone hummed over soup in a kitchen that smelled of star anise, and the particular peace that comes from being deeply loved. Luna appeared in the doorway, her whisper jars chiming with unusual brightness, their contained light seeming to pulse in rhythm with the coffee's transformation. "The pathways are opening," she announced, her dark eyes wide with reverent excitement. "The map isn't just showing connections anymore, it's becoming one." Throughout the morning, each cup Samuel prepared seemed to carry its own subtle signature. From elsewhere, the businessman who rushed in for his daily double shot found his coffee tasting like the particular peace that comes from knowing you're valued for your kindness rather than your efficiency. He stood at the counter longer than usual, his phone forgotten in his pocket, breathing in steam that carried the essence of boardrooms where collaboration had replaced competition. The young mother, with her restless baby, discovered that her cappuccino held the warmth of summer afternoons in fields of wildflowers, complete with the drowsy hum of contented bees and the soft rustle of grass bending to gentle wind. "I've never been to a place like that," she murmured, her baby settling peacefully in her arms. "But I feel like I've just spent hours there, watching butterflies and listening to the world breathe." Mira descended from the garden carrying herbs that seemed to glow with their own inner vitality, as if they had absorbed some of the dimensional energy flowing through the cafe. "The plants are singing louder," she announced, her face bright with discovery. "They're responding to flavors from other realities, learning new ways to be generous with their gifts." As she worked with Ori to incorporate these transformed herbs into the day's offerings, each ingredient seemed to carry its own story from elsewhere. Basil that remembered dimensions where every meal was prepared with gratitude, where cooking was considered a form of prayer. Rosemary that held memories of kitchens where elders were treasured for their wisdom, where recipes were passed down like sacred texts carrying the accumulated love of generations. Dr. Martinez arrived during his game lunch break and ordered his usual simple coffee, black with 1 sugar. But when he lifted the cup to his lips, the first sip brought tears to his eyes, not of sadness, but of profound recognition. "This tastes like the medicine I've always wanted to practice," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Like healing that doesn't require anyone to be broken first." Ori began to understand their role in this gentle transformation, their hands learning to guide Samuel's work, not just with technical precision, but with the subtle adjustments that shaped the emotional contours of each cup. A slightly finer grind for someone who needed the clarity of a sharp, clean memory. A touch more steam for another who craved the comforting warmth of a gentle embrace. The espresso machine, now a willing collaborator, responded to Ori's touch with uncanny precision, its hum adjusting to produce exactly the desired emotional resonance. Luna's whisper jars began to pulse in synchronized rhythms, their contained light growing brighter as the afternoon wore on. "They're collecting new whispers," she explained, watching the glass containers with fascination. "Conversations from the realities we're connecting with. People talking about what it feels like to live in worlds where kindness won." A teenager, who had never spoken to anyone in the cafe beyond ordering his usual hot chocolate, found himself sharing stories with the elderly gentleman at the next table, both of them discovering that their drinks carried flavors that reminded them of the particular comfort that comes from being truly heard. Their conversation wove through the afternoon like a gentle stream, touching on dreams and disappointments with the easy intimacy of people who had suddenly remembered that connection was possible. As evening approached, the cafe had become something unprecedented, a place where the boundaries between realities had grown thin enough for healing to flow freely between worlds. Each cup served carried whispers from dimensions where different choices had led to different outcomes, where brilliance had learned to serve rather than dominate, where the most important discoveries were about how to help people feel safe and valued. Samuel moved through his work with the quiet awe of someone witnessing a miracle that had chosen to express itself through the familiar tools of his trade. The cutting board seemed to gleam with new purpose, ready not just to prepare food, but to serve as an altar where ingredients from multiple realities could be combined with love. When the last customer left that evening, the cafe settled into its nighttime quiet with a different quality of peace. The air itself seemed to shimmer with residual energy from the day's dimensional exchanges, and Luna's map glowed with pathways that pulsed like living arteries carrying compassion between worlds. "We've become a crossing point," Ori said softly, their small hands resting on the cutting board that had been their first teacher in the language of care. "A place where people can taste what the world could be like if we chose gentleness over force." As they prepared to close, Ori noticed something they had seen before but never understood, the way Luna's gaze always traveled outward, following the journeys of whispers and cups and guests, but never quite rested on the soft echo of her own breath. She helped everyone else find their dreams, but when had she last dreamed her own? The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light and held it like a promise, while somewhere in the distance, the wind carried fresh whispers from newly accessible realities. Fragments of conversations where people spoke about their local cafe as if it were a place where miracles happened daily, where ordinary acts of kindness had learned to transcend the boundaries between worlds. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm a new understanding settled into place. They had learned to open doorways for others, but tomorrow would bring a different lesson. How to create a threshold that opened inward so that the girl who collected everyone else's whispers could finally learn to hear the gentle stories that were waiting patiently, with her own name written in starlight. The morning after the cafe had become a gentle portal between realities brought with it a quality of light that seemed to carry whispers of its own, and Ori noticed immediately how Luna moved through the transformed space with a different kind of attention. She arranged her collection with even greater care than usual, each jar positioned to catch the dimensional energies that still hummed softly through the air. But there was something in her posture, a subtle tension in her shoulders, a wistfulness, in the way her gaze lingered on the empty spaces between her glowing vessels, that spoke of a need she hadn't yet learned to name. The cafe's new role as a crossing point between gentle worlds had amplified everything, including the whispers Luna collected. Her jars pulsed with unprecedented brightness, filled with fragments from realities where kindness had learned to be the loudest sound, where intelligence served love rather than ego. She moved between them like a curator in the world's most precious museum, selecting which whisper might comfort a grieving customer, which fragment of peace might find its way to a troubled soul. But Ori, watching with the same careful attention they brought to reading the unspoken needs of cafe customers, sensed something Luna herself might not have recognized, the particular silence of someone who had spent so long listening to others' dreams that she had forgotten how to hear her own. It was in the way she paused sometimes, her hand hovering over an empty jar with an expression of longing. She quickly smoothed away, as if catching herself in an act of selfishness. "The whispers from the gentle worlds are growing stronger," Luna said softly as Ori approached her corner by the window. She held up a jar that shimmered with light the color of dawn, breaking over calm water. "This one carries the sound of children laughing without fear, and this one," she touched another, "vessel, holds the echo of a grandfather teaching his grandson that being smart means knowing how to be kind." Her voice carried its usual wonder, but underneath, Ori detected something else, a note of wistfulness that suggested Luna was beginning to understand the difference between witnessing beauty and allowing herself to experience it. She had become so skilled at collecting fragments of other people's hope that she had never learned to tend her own. Samuel appeared with his morning tea, moving with the gentle awareness of someone who had learned to recognize when the next lesson was ready to reveal itself. "Luna," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from her with the unhurried grace that made difficult conversations feel safe. "When was the last time you listened to something that wasn't a whisper from somewhere else?" Luna looked up, confusion flickering across her features. "I don't understand." The whispers are everything. They carry all the beauty that gets lost between worlds, all the gentleness that people forget they deserve. But what about your gentleness? Ori asked, their voice carrying the same soft authority they used when helping customers recognize their own needs. What about the dreams that belong to you, not to the wind or the spaces between realities? For a moment, Luna's careful composure wavered, revealing something vulnerable beneath. I don't think I have any, she admitted, her fingers tightening around an empty jar. Every time I try to listen inward, all I hear is silence. Not the good kind, just nothing. Mira descended from the garden carrying herbs that seemed to glow with their own inner vitality, as if they had absorbed some of the dimensional energy flowing through the cafe. She paused, taking in the scene with eyes that had learned to read the emotional weather of growing things. Some seeds need different conditions to sprout, she said gently, settling beside them with the natural authority of someone who understood the patience required for beautiful things to emerge. Luna, you've been so busy tending everyone else's dreams that your own haven't had the right soil to grow in. The invitation came not as pressure, but as possibility. Would Luna like to learn how to create space for her own hopes to unfurl? The garden at twilight became their classroom, the impossible plants breathing slowly in the cooling air, while Mira prepared a quiet corner where the lavender grew, a spot that caught the gentle evening light and was sheltered from the stronger winds. This is for you, Mira said, her hands guiding Luna's to the dark, rich soil. No collection, no curation, just planting, just allowing whatever wants to grow to find its own way toward the light. Ori knelt beside them, understanding their role not as teacher but as companion, offering the same gentle presence they brought to the espresso machine when it needed to remember its rhythm. They helped Luna feel the difference between soil that was ready for planting and earth that needed more time to prepare itself, showing her how to listen with her whole being rather than just her ears. What does your heart want? Ori asked softly, when it's not busy listening to other hearts. Luna closed her eyes, her breathing gradually aligning with the garden's subtle pulse. For the first time in years, she turned her extraordinary listening ability inward, past the familiar chorus of collected whispers, into the deeper silence where her own hopes had been waiting with infinite patience. What emerged wasn't grand or dramatic, just a quiet longing for a place where people could come to remember the gentleness they had forgotten they deserved. A library, she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the evening air. But not for books, for moments, for all the kindness that gets lost in the spaces between words. As she spoke, something began to shimmer in the empty jar she still held. Not borrowed light from other realities, but the unique luminescence of her own hope finally given permission to shine. It was the color of libraries at closing time, warm and golden and full of stories breathing quietly in peaceful darkness. Samuel appeared with cups of the transformed coffee, each one carrying flavors from dimensions where Luna's dream already existed. Realities where libraries of gentleness were as common as parks, where people gathered regularly to tend the moments that had taught them how to be kind. As Luna sipped, she could taste the particular satisfaction that comes from meaningful work, the deep contentment of helping others remember their own capacity for healing. Mira showed her how to plant actual seeds in a small pot she could carry, herbs that would grow into the physical foundation for the healing space she envisioned. Every dream needs an anchor in the ordinary world, Mira explained, guiding Luna's hands as they pressed tiny seeds into the soil. Something you can touch and tend, something that reminds you that beautiful things can grow from the smallest beginnings. As the evening deepened around them, Luna's education in dreaming continued. She learned to distinguish between the voices that encouraged her hopes and the ones that suggested she should remain content with serving others' visions. Her whisper jars, responding to this shift, began to glow with a different quality of light. Not just collected fragments from elsewhere, but reflections of her own emerging dreams. The cafe below hummed with its new role as a dimensional crossing point, but now it carried an additional layer of meaning. Luna's permission to dream seemed to strengthen the pathways between gentle realities, making it easier for compassion to flow between worlds. Customers began leaving notes that spoke not just of comfort received, but of inspiration awakened. Evidence that witnessing someone else's courage to hope could kindle the same courage in others. When Luna finally descended the garden stairs, she carried with her the glowing jar of her own dreams, the small pot of planted seeds, and most importantly, the understanding that her gift for helping others find their hopes had been incomplete without learning to nurture her own. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light and held it like a promise, while Luna's map of gentle worlds pulsed with new pathways, routes that led not just to other realities, but to the infinite possibilities that opened when someone finally gave themselves permission to dream. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, another profound lesson had been learned. Luna had discovered that the most generous act wasn't always to give others what they needed, but sometimes to model for them what it looked like to tend your own hopes with the same reverence you brought to everyone else's. Her empty jar now glowed with steady, peaceful light, not a whisper from elsewhere, but the sound of her own heart finally learning to speak its truth into the patient darkness, ready to be heard by anyone who needed to remember that their own dreams were worthy of the same careful attention they offered to others. Outside, the evening wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, and among them, for the first time, were fragments of Luna's own hopes, dreams that had learned to trust themselves enough to take flight, ready to be collected by other gentle souls who needed to remember that the most important library they could build was the one that held space for their own beautiful, impossible longings. The morning after Luna had learned to tend her own dreams brought with it a quality of light that seemed to carry whispers of transformation, and it was Mrs. Alvarez at the town library who first noticed that something fundamental had shifted in the quiet spaces where stories lived. She arrived to find that the familiar building breathed differently, as if the very air had grown more attentive, more receptive to the possibility that books could be more than repositories of words. They could become sanctuaries for the stories. That almost were. Luna felt the pull immediately when she passed the library on her way to the cafe, her newly planted seeds secure in their small pot, and her dream jar glowing with steady, peaceful light. The building's windows seemed to catch the morning sun differently, holding light the way cupped hands hold water, and she found herself drawn up the worn stone steps with the same inevitability that had once guided her to collect whispers from the wind. "There's something upstairs," Mrs. Alvarez murmured as Luna entered, her voice carrying the particular wonder of someone who had spent decades among books and suddenly discovered they were capable of new conversations. A section that wasn't there yesterday, but feels like it's been waiting for years. Books that seem to be writing themselves, stories that taste of recognition without quite achieving the clarity of actual memory. The climb to the second floor felt like ascending between worlds, each step carrying Luna deeper into the understanding that her permission to dream had created ripples that reached far beyond her own heart. When she pushed open the door to the local history section, the space that greeted her had expanded in ways that defied the building's modest architecture, filled with shelves that seemed to breathe with their own quiet purpose. The books themselves were bound in soft leather the color of twilight, their spines bearing titles that shifted and settled as she watched, words arranging themselves according to the needs of whoever approached them. The grandfather who built lullabies, instead of weapons, adventures in gentle dimensions where every conflict finds understanding. The universe where intelligence learned to whisper. Each volume hummed with the same frequency as Luna's whisper jars, as if they contained fragments of the same infinite conversation between realities where kindness had learned to be the loudest sound. When Ori and Samuel arrived, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had guided Luna, they found her seated at a reading table scarred by years of gentle use, surrounded by books that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The air around her shimmered with the same quality they had learned to recognize when the cafe's dimensional pathways opened, but softer, more stable, as if this transformation was meant to be permanent rather than fleeting. "These are the almost memories," Luna explained, her voice thick with wonder as she opened a volume whose pages exhaled the faint scent of rosemary and the clean brightness of morning light. "The stories from the gentle worlds, the versions where different choices led to different outcomes. They're collecting here because someone finally created space for them to exist." Ori approached the nearest shelf with the reverence they brought to the cutting board, sensing immediately that these books were alive in the same way Mira's impossible plants were alive, responsive to attention, generous with their gifts when approached with the right kind of listening. When they touched a spine labeled "The Scientist Who Remembered How to Be Kind," warmth spread through their palm, and they felt the familiar sensation of emotional architecture adjusting itself, making space for healing to occur. The story within was of a brilliant mind, wild-haired and endlessly curious, whose intelligence had chosen to serve connection rather than conquest. In this gentle version, portal technology had been developed not for escape or dominance, but for sharing, devices that could carry comfort to places where it was needed most, inventions that helped families understand each other's unspoken longings, experiments in the alchemy of human kindness that made the multiverse a more beautiful place rather than a more dangerous one. Samuel discovered a section devoted to stories of nourishment, tales of cafes where every meal was prepared with gratitude, where cooking was considered a form of prayer, where the simple act of feeding someone became a profound expression of love. As he read, he felt the familiar rightness settle deep in his chest, the same sensation he experienced when the espresso machine found its perfect rhythm or when a sandwich emerged exactly as someone needed it to be. Mrs. Chen, arriving for her morning constitutional, found herself drawn to a volume whose cover depicted a garden where flowers bloomed in impossible seasons, tended by hands that understood the language of growing things. The sister who taught children how to listen to plants. As she read, tears flowed freely down her cheeks, but they were different tears now, not the bitter salt of loss, but the cleaner flow of grief that had found a gentle alternative to despair. Proof that love continued its work, even when separated by the thin membrane between what was and what could have been. The library revealed its deeper purpose as the morning progressed. Each book seemed to respond to the emotional climate of its readers, pages turning themselves to exactly the passages that needed to be found, stories adjusting their emphasis to address the particular hungers of whoever approached them. When Dr. Martinez arrived during his lunch break, drawn by reports of the transformation, he found waiting for him tales of medicine practiced with infinite patience, realities where healing was understood as a conversation between doctor and patient rather than a battle against symptoms. Luna's whisper jars, responding to the library's presence, began to pulse with unprecedented brightness, their contained light seeming to flow between the books like luminous threads connecting all. The gentle possibilities. She understood now that her collection had been preparing for this moment. Each whisper she had saved was a fragment of these larger stories, proof that the almost memories were not fantasies, but living, breathing realities that existed in the spaces between what was and what could be. As afternoon settled over the library like a comfortable blanket, the books began to reveal their most profound gift. They were not just stories to be read, but templates for transformation, blueprints that showed how the familiar struggles of existence could find gentle resolutions. The businessman who had been changed by Ori's sandwiches discovered narratives about boardrooms where collaboration had replaced competition, where success was measured in terms of human flourishing rather than quarterly profits. The young artist, who had found his way back to his canvas with the help of Ori's Riverstone, spent hours sketching characters from the almost memories, his work gaining a new depth as he translated the library's gentle visions into images that could be shared with others. His drawings began to appear around town, murals depicting scenes where families learned to love each other's flaws, where the most complex problems were solved not through force, but through the patient application of understanding.